She stood at his door at midnight, soaked, shaking, and running from people who wanted her empire and wouldn't stop at just that. For 3 months, Logan Pierce had refused to even learn her name. She was everything he'd taught himself to hate: rich, powerful, untouchable. But the woman on the other side of that door wasn't untouchable. She was terrified. And his 6-year-old daughter was already awake, already watching, already walking toward the stranger with her arms open. Some doors, once opened, don't close again. This is the story of 2 people who lived 10 feet apart and spent 3 months pretending the other didn't exist, until the night the storm made that impossible. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The hallway on the 14th floor of the Caldwell building smelled like old wood polish, and whatever Mrs. Toronto on the far end kept cooking every Sunday. Something with onions and bay leaves that seeped under the doors and settled into the carpet fibers like a permanent resident. Logan Pierce had lived in apartment 1407 for 2 years, and in that time, he'd memorized the sounds of the building the way a man memorizes the layout of a house in the dark. The elevator's low groan before the doors opened, the pipes that rattled in the east wall when someone on the 16th floor ran a bath, the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard outside his own front door that always gave him half a second of warning before his daughter came running. He knew everything about this building. He knew almost nothing about the woman in 1408. Her name was on the mailbox downstairs, V. Hale, printed on a small white card that looked like it had been typed by someone's assistant. The building manager, a cheerful retired plumber named Gus, had mentioned her exactly once, about 3 weeks after she moved in, standing in the lobby with a look on his face like he'd just met a minor celebrity. "You know who's living across from you?" Gus had said, nodding toward the elevator. "Victoria Hale, the tech woman. Hale Systems." Logan had nodded like the name meant something to him. It didn't. He'd looked her up that night after Sophie was asleep, mostly because Gus's expression had stuck with him. 30 years old, founded Hale Systems at 24 out of a converted warehouse in Austin, with 2 college friends and a business plan she'd written in a coffee shop. By 27, the company was publicly traded. By 29, she was on the cover of 3 different magazines, photographed always in the same way, standing, arms slightly crossed, looking directly into the camera like she was daring it to blink first. Net worth estimated somewhere between 2 and 4 billion, depending on which outlet you read. Logan had closed his laptop and gone to bed. He wasn't hostile to her, not exactly, but in the 3 months since she'd moved into 1408, he'd developed a clean, uncomplicated system for managing their proximity. Nod if they happened to be at the elevator at the same time, which happened twice. Don't make conversation. Don't make eye contact longer than politeness required. It wasn't personal. It was just that he'd spent the last 4 years simplifying his life down to its essential elements: Sophie, work, sleep, repeat. And he'd found that the fewer complications he added, the fewer things could go wrong. Rich neighbors were complications. Rich neighbors who showed up in the lobby with security personnel and left in cars that cost more than his annual salary were the kind of complication he'd learned, the hard way, not to invite. The storm that came in off the coast that October didn't warn anyone particularly well. The forecast had mentioned rain, the kind of vague meteorological honesty that covers a range of outcomes without committing to any of them. What arrived instead was something that hit the city like it was trying to make a point. Wind that shook the window frames, rain that came sideways, thunder that rolled in from the harbor and sat over the building like a held breath before releasing. Sophie had woken up at 9:30, dragged her blanket to his bedroom doorway, and stood there looking at him with the particular expression she used when she wanted something she knew he couldn't technically refuse. "Can I sleep in here?" "Yeah, come here." She'd climbed up next to him with her blanket and her stuffed elephant, a battered gray thing named Peanut that had been washed so many times the felt on its ears had gone thin. And she'd fallen back asleep within 10 minutes, one arm thrown over his ribs like a seatbelt. Logan lay awake, listening to the storm work itself against the windows, and thought about nothing in particular. That was a skill he'd developed in the years after Claire died. The ability to let his mind go genuinely blank, to not fill the silence with grief or planning or the low-grade anxiety that had once been his constant companion. It had taken almost 2 years to get there. He was proud of it in a quiet way. He was somewhere between awake and not when the knock came. It wasn't loud. That was the first strange thing. It was hesitant, almost apologetic, like whoever was on the other side wasn't entirely sure they were doing the right thing. Logan opened his eyes and listened, half convinced he'd imagined it. The storm was loud enough to manufacture sounds. Then it came again. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 more. He checked the time. 12:14 a.m. He eased out from under Sophie's arm, careful not to wake her, and pulled on the jeans he'd left on the chair by the bed. He grabbed his phone out of habit, the screen casting a pale rectangle on the ceiling, and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, the hallway looked the same as always. The overhead light slightly yellowed, the carpet running its faded pattern toward the elevator. But standing in front of his door, one hand still raised, was a woman he recognized from 2 brief moments in the lobby and a series of magazine photographs, except that she looked nothing like any of those things right now. Victoria Hale was soaking wet. Her hair was dark with water, plastered against her neck and one cheek. She was wearing a light jacket that had done nothing against the storm, and she was holding a small wheeled suitcase, the carry-on kind, black, expensive-looking, with one hand, and with the other hand she was gripping the strap of a laptop bag pressed tight against her side. Her jaw was set in the way people set their jaw when they're trying very hard not to look like they're scared, which mostly just makes it obvious that they are. Logan unlocked the door and opened it. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. Her voice was steadier than her expression. "I know it's late. I know this is—" She stopped, pushed a strand of wet hair off her face. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." He looked at her. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at the laptop bag she was holding like it contained something breakable. "What happened? I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I know how strange this is." She looked him in the eye. Whatever she was feeling, she had enough composure left to meet his gaze directly. "Can I come in? Just tonight. I'll explain everything I can, but I can't go back to my apartment right now, and I can't— There are people who—" She stopped again, took one short breath. "Please." Logan stood in the doorway for a moment. He could hear the storm through the walls. He could hear Sophie shifting in the bedroom. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." She stood in his entryway, dripping onto the hardwood floor, and the first thing he did was go get towels. He brought 2 from the bathroom, the big ones, the decent ones he saved for Sophie's baths, and handed them over without saying anything. She took them with both hands, which meant she had to set down the laptop bag, which she did carefully, at her feet, keeping it in contact with her ankle. "Thank you," she said. Her teeth weren't quite chattering, but they were close. "There's a bathroom at the end of the hall. You can—" He gestured. "I'm fine, She wrapped one towel over her hair and pressed the other against her jacket, which was pointless because the jacket was completely saturated. "I need to tell you what's happening first, before I do anything else. You should know what I've asked you to—" "Go dry off," Logan said. "Whatever you need to tell me will still be true in 5 minutes." She looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. The kind of look people get when they've been bracing for resistance and don't receive it. "Okay," she said. She took the laptop bag with her. "Hot." Logan put a pot of water on for tea because it was something to do with his hands. He stood in the kitchen and listened to the sounds coming from the bathroom, water running, the particular creak of the cabinet under the sink, and tried to figure out what he thought about the situation. He didn't know this woman. He'd made a point of not knowing her. And now she was in his bathroom at 12:15 in the morning, soaking wet and scared, holding a laptop bag like it was the most important thing she owned. He thought about his rule: no complications. He looked at the bedroom door, which was still closed, Sophie still asleep behind it. He thought, well, it's already complicated. The water boiled. He made 2 cups, found the honey that Sophie liked in her tea when she was sick, added some to 1 cup without thinking about it, and set both on the coffee table in the living room. Victoria came out of the bathroom in dry clothes. She'd gotten a change of clothes out of the suitcase, apparently. Dark gray sweatpants and a plain, long-sleeved shirt that made her look like someone who existed in between her public-facing life and something else. Her hair was still damp, but no longer dripping. She'd lost the posture that the magazine photographs always showed her in, that deliberate, considered stance. And she was standing in his living room the way people stand in unfamiliar places, slightly uncertain about where to put themselves. She saw the tea on the coffee table, and something crossed her face that she didn't have time to hide. "Sit down," he said. She sat on the edge of the couch, the laptop bag on the cushion beside her. She wrapped both hands around the mug and held it without drinking. Logan sat in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees. "Tell me what happened," he said. She looked at the middle distance for a moment, organizing whatever she was about to say. He had the sense she was deciding how much to tell him, not whether to lie to him, which were different things, and he'd learned to read the difference. "There's a faction inside my company," she said. "I've known something was wrong for about 6 months. Financial irregularities, money moving through accounts in ways that shouldn't have been authorized, contracts going to firms I'd never approved, vendor relationships that nobody could fully explain to me when I asked." She paused. 3 weeks ago, I started quietly pulling records. Myself, with one person I trust. Not through internal IT, not through any channel that would flag. "What did you find?" "Enough to end careers. End more than careers." She said it flatly, without satisfaction. "About $40 million in misappropriated funds over the past 18 months. Kickbacks, inflated contracts, a secondary entity set up to siphon revenue from 3 of our most profitable product lines." She looked at him. "My CFO is involved. 2 members of the board. And my former—" She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "A senior executive who has been positioned for the past year to look like the obvious choice to replace me if the board ever moved to push me out. So someone's been setting up to take your company." "Yes." "And they found out you know." She looked at him steadily. "I think so. Tonight I was at the office late. I do that sometimes. It's quieter. I can actually think. I went down to the parking garage and my car was the only one there. 2 men were near it. I didn't recognize either of them. They weren't security. I know our security team, all of them. They saw me and one of them started toward me." She picked up the tea and finally took a drink. Her hands were steady now. "I got back to the elevator. I went up, not down. I went out through the service entrance on the 4th floor and got a cab. I didn't go home. I went to a hotel 2 blocks from here, paid cash, and sat in the lobby for an hour watching the door. And then you came here." "I live right across the hall," she said, and there was a tired, self-aware edge to it. I know we haven't exactly—" She stopped. "I didn't know who else to ask. I have people I trust, but calling them tonight means phone records, and right now I don't know what they have access to, what they're watching." She looked at the laptop bag. "This has everything, the records, the documentation, the timeline. This is the only copy that exists outside the company's servers, and I pulled it tonight specifically because I was afraid this was coming." She looked back at him. "I'm sorry. I know you don't know me. I know this is a lot to ask of someone you've barely spoken to." Logan was quiet for a moment. "Are those men going to come here?" "I don't think so. They don't know where I went, and my name isn't associated with this address. My legal address of record is in Austin." She paused. "But I don't know for certain." "Okay." He leaned back in the chair. "There's a deadbolt on the front door and a chain. They're both on." He looked at her. "You can have the bedroom. Sophie's in there with me anyway. The couch pulls out." "I'm not taking your bed." "I wasn't offering you my bed. I offered you the bedroom. There's a lock on it." She stared at him. He could tell she'd been bracing for a different conversation, the one where he asked her to leave, or where he argued with her, or where he told her this wasn't his problem. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. It wasn't suspicious exactly, but it wasn't fully easy either. Logan thought about it honestly for a second. "Because you knocked and said, 'Please,'" he said. "That's about as much as I need." He woke up at 6:17 to the smell of coffee, which was disorienting because he hadn't set the machine. For about 3 seconds, he lay on the pullout in the living room, which was, as pullouts go, exactly as uncomfortable as pullouts always are, with the particular blankness of a person whose brain hasn't fully caught up to the previous night. Then he heard Sophie's voice from the kitchen, high and certain the way 6-year-olds always sound when they've decided something. But how do you know which ones are decaf because they look the same to me? They're both brown. The bag says it on the front. Victoria's voice, patient, a little careful. See? This one says decaf right here. Oh, a pause. Why do grown-ups drink the kind without the energy if the point is to wake up? That is an excellent question that I have been asking for years. Logan sat up. He could hear Sophie thinking about this. I'm Sophie, she announced, apparently having decided introductions were overdue. I know, I've seen you in the hallway. A beat. I'm Victoria. I live across the hall. I know, Sophie said, matching her tone precisely. You have the fancy doormat. I do have a fancy doormat. Daddy doesn't like fancy things. Sophie. Logan appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in yesterday's jeans and an old t-shirt, hair in whatever shape the pullout had given it. His daughter was sitting on the counter, which he'd told her 1,100 times not to do, watching Victoria operate the coffee machine with an expression of intense scientific observation. Victoria had apparently raided his cabinet for mugs and found the 2 decent ones, which were both now in use. You have a great kid, Victoria said, glancing at him. She looked less rough than the night before, but not exactly rested. She'd pulled her hair back and the dark circles under her eyes were visible in the morning light. She shouldn't be on the counter, he said. I told her that. I balanced, Sophie said. Logan lifted her off the counter, which she submitted to without complaint, and set her down on the floor. She immediately went to the table, pulled out her chair, and sat in it with the air of someone who had always been sitting in chairs and would never dream of climbing on counters. Did you make enough for 2? He said. 3, Victoria said. She's having decaf. Sophie made an expression that conveyed mature acceptance of unfair circumstance. Logan got down a 3rd mug. He was aware that this was already more domestic than any morning in this apartment had been in a while, more than 2 years probably, and that he hadn't planned for it and couldn't quite get his bearings on how he felt about it. Victoria moved slightly to give him access to the coffee machine, a small, automatic gesture, and they stood in the kitchen that was honestly too small for 2 adults to stand in comfortably without negotiating the space. And he poured his coffee, and she stepped back toward the counter, and neither of them said anything about any of it. Did you sleep? He asked. A little. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I looked through the files again at about 4 in the morning. I wanted to make sure I had what I thought I had. She glanced at Sophie, who was arranging the salt and pepper shakers into a pattern on the table. I do. How bad? Bad enough that 3 people are going to prison if a prosecutor gets this. She said it quietly. And bad enough that they'll work very hard to make sure a prosecutor never sees it. Logan thought about this. Sophie had abandoned the salt and pepper shakers and was now telling Peanut, the elephant, about the thunderstorm from the previous night, providing what appeared to be a comprehensive meteorological briefing. I need to make a call this morning, Victoria said, still quiet. Someone I trust, my general counsel. She's been with me since the beginning. She's not involved in any of this. I'd stake everything on that. I need to get this documentation to her, get it formally secured, and then I need to figure out the next move. Do you think they'll come looking for you? They'll look. Whether they look here... She shook her head. I don't think so. But I've been wrong about people before, recently and significantly. Logan looked at his daughter, who was now demonstrating to Peanut what thunder sounded like by patting the table rhythmically. You can stay, he said. Today, until you make your call and figure out what you're doing. After that, I'll figure out somewhere safer, Victoria said. I'm not asking to move in. The edge of something like dry humor in it, barely there. I know that. I really do appreciate... You don't have to keep thanking me. She looked at him for a moment. You don't like people who have money, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It landed somewhere more like an observation. Logan picked up his coffee. I don't have a problem with money. But you've spent 3 months making it clear you want nothing to do with me. I wanted nothing to do with anyone, he said. That's different. She held his gaze for a second, then looked down at her coffee. He had the sense that she was used to knowing exactly how a room felt about her, and that she wasn't quite sure how to categorize him, and that it bothered her more than she'd expected it to. "Daddy," Sophie announced from the table, "can Victoria eat breakfast with us?" Logan looked at his daughter, who was watching him with the particular transparent hope that 6-year-olds have not yet learned to disguise. "If she wants to," he said. Sophie turned to Victoria with the solemnity of a formal invitation. "We have eggs," she said, "and the bread that's almost gone, but there's enough." Victoria Hale, billionaire, founder of a company worth several $billions, turned to a 6-year-old and said, "I would love to have eggs and the bread that's almost gone." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and hopped off her chair to help. Bomb. The morning passed in the strange, suspended way that mornings pass when the normal rules have been temporarily lifted. Logan made scrambled eggs. Sophie explained in great detail the proper way to eat them, which apparently involved not mixing them with the toast until the very last second. Victoria listened to this instruction with the focused attention of someone being briefed on something important. Outside, the storm had completely cleared, leaving that particular October brightness that comes after heavy rain, the sky sharp and blue, the streets below still dark with water. Logan could see a slice of it from the kitchen window between the buildings. He thought about 3 months ago, moving down the same hallway with Sophie's backpack over one shoulder and a grocery bag in each hand, catching a glimpse through the open door of 1408. Movers in the apartment, boxes stacked, a woman with her back to him giving directions about where something should go. He'd looked for about 2 seconds and then looked away and kept walking. He'd thought, not my business. He still thought that, more or less. But he was beginning to understand that the version of the situation he'd constructed in his head, the untouchable billionaire, the world divided cleanly into people who'd been ground down by life and people who hadn't, was a simpler picture than the actual one. After breakfast, Sophie went to the living room with Peanut and the serious business of Saturday morning cartoons. Victoria helped clear the plates without being asked, which he noticed and stood at the sink and rinsed them while he put the pan to soak, and they stood in the small kitchen in the aftermath of breakfast with the quiet that comes when two people have been talking and have temporarily run out of things to say. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Sure." She handed him the plate she'd rinsed. "How long have you been doing this alone?" He knew what she was asking. He put the plate in the drying rack. 4 years, he said. She nodded, not pressing. There was something about the way she received information. She didn't fill it immediately with sympathy or follow-up questions. Just let it sit there. "Her name," she said. "Sophie. You let her pick Peanut's name?" "She named him herself at 3. I tried to suggest other names." "What names?" "Ellie, Stomper, Gerald." "Gerald. For the elephant, like in the book." She rejected Gerald. She looked at me like I'd suggested something deeply offensive. Victoria smiled. It was the first real one he'd seen from her. Not the photographs and cameras kind, not the carefully managed expression of a person who spent too much time being looked at. An actual smile, quick and slightly surprised, like she hadn't expected to produce it. "She's something," she said. "Yeah," Logan said. "She is." Victoria made her call at 10 in the morning, standing in the bedroom with the door closed and the laptop bag open on the bed beside her. Logan took Sophie to the lobby to check the mailbox. There was nothing. There never was on Saturdays. And then stood in the lobby with her while she investigated a crack in the marble floor that she had apparently never noticed before and found extremely significant. "Is she going to stay?" Sophie asked, without looking up from the crack. "No, Sophie, she has her own apartment." "But she slept here." "She needed somewhere to sleep." Sophie looked up. "Is she in trouble?" Logan looked at his 6-year-old daughter, who was kneeling on the lobby floor in her pajama pants and a t-shirt with a cartoon cat on it, watching him with large brown eyes that belonged to her mother. "A little bit," he said. Sophie considered this. "We should help her then." "We are helping her." "Good." She looked back at the crack. "I'm going to name this crack Gerald." "That's, Logan stopped. "Yeah, okay." Victoria was still on the phone when they got back upstairs. Logan could hear the muffled conversation through the bedroom door. Measured, controlled, the tone of someone walking a colleague through a complicated situation, point by point. He made Sophie's mid-morning snack, apple slices and peanut butter, which had been the Saturday ritual since she was 4, and sat at the table with her while she ate and drew a picture that was supposedly of Peanut, but looked more like a gray rectangle with legs. The bedroom door opened at 11:15. Victoria came out looking different again. The careful composure she'd carried the night before was back, but it looked less brittle now, like the call had given her back something that the night had taken. "My general counsel is sending someone to pick up the drive," she said. 3:00 this afternoon. Once she has it secured, it changes the situation significantly. She stood in the living room doorway, looking at him. "This is going to be a fight. I want you to know that. The man behind this, Marcus Calloway, he's our chief strategy officer. He has a lot of resources, and he's very good at making other people look like the problem." She said it without drama, the way someone states a fact they've already accepted. "But he doesn't have what I have on that drive." "What happens after 3:00? Logan asked. "I need to get to a board member I trust before Calloway does. There are 2 members of the board who aren't involved in this. If I can get to them first, with documentation—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. You don't need to know all of this." "No, it's fine." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, same question as last night, and he realized she was genuinely trying to understand it, not suspicious now, but actually uncertain. "I told you." "Because I knocked and said please." She didn't believe it was that simple. Logan leaned back in his chair. "You look scared," he said. "In my experience, people who look scared at midnight on other people's doorsteps are either actually in trouble or completely crazy, and you didn't seem crazy." "What if I had been?" "Then I'd have closed the door." She looked at him for a long moment. Sophie was still at the table, adding details to the picture of Peanut, appearing to have heard none of this, while almost certainly having heard all of it. "I don't usually ask for help," Victoria said. "I know, it showed." That almost smile again, there and gone. "Was it that obvious?" "The way you apologized for knocking, yeah. I practiced what I was going to say in the cab on the way here." She said it like she was slightly ashamed of it, and he understood that for someone like her, needing to prepare a speech to ask her neighbor for help was its own small humiliation. "I had a whole thing, much more professional. How'd that go?" "I completely forgot all of it the second you opened the door." Logan nodded. "Tea helped?" "The tea helped," she confirmed. "And the honey. You put honey in it." He hadn't thought about it at the time. He said nothing about it now. The 3:00 handoff happened in the lobby. A woman named Dana, compact and efficient, arrived in a car with tinted windows, received the external hard drive from Victoria in a small padded envelope, and left again in under 4 minutes. Logan had been downstairs getting quarters from the laundry machine and had watched the whole thing from across the lobby with the detached observation of someone watching a very quiet movie. Victoria came back up in the elevator with him. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, which happened sometimes on Saturday afternoons, the cartoon giving way to sleep in the reliable way it always did. "It's done," Victoria said in the elevator. She was looking at the doors. "How do you feel?" She thought about it. "Terrified," she said, "and like I can breathe for the first time in 3 weeks." She turned to look at him, both at the same time. "That happens," he said. The elevator opened on Fortin. They walked down the hallway, and at the point where she would go left to 1408, and he would go right to 1407, they both stopped. "I should go," she said. "Check my apartment. Make sure—" She stopped. "I don't actually know what I'm checking for." "Do you want me to come with you?" It was out before he'd thought about it. She looked at him in a way that made him think she was deciding whether to say yes or whether to say she was fine. "Yes," she said. They checked her apartment, all of it, which took about 8 minutes. Nothing had been touched. It looked like what it was. A very expensively furnished apartment that a very busy person lived in, which meant it was impeccably arranged and had the particular emptiness of a place that was a home by registration but not entirely by habit. A bookshelf, fully stocked, but the books were organized by color, which was either the sign of someone who cared deeply about aesthetics or someone who had never opened them. A kitchen with a coffee machine that cost more than his rent. a window that looked out over the city at a different angle than his own, showing more of the waterfront. "Okay," Logan said when they'd checked the last room. "Nothing." "Thank you," Victoria said. She was standing in the middle of her living room, looking at it. He had the feeling she'd said those words more in the last 18 hours than she'd said them in the past several months, and that she meant them each time, which was the more interesting thing. "Sophie's going to want to know if you'll stay for dinner," he said. Victoria blinked, surprised. "She doesn't have to," he added. I'm not." "I'll stay for dinner," Victoria said. She stayed for dinner. Pasta, because it was Sophie's request, and Saturday pasta was apparently law. And she helped with the dishes again, and Sophie at some point migrated from her chair to leaning against Victoria's side on the couch while they watched one of her shows, completely without invitation, the way children do when they've decided they're comfortable somewhere. And Victoria sat there and let it happen and looked at Logan over Sophie's head with an expression he didn't have a word for. At 8:30, Sophie went to bed. Victoria stood at his front door with her laptop bag, which she'd retrieved from the bedroom, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was a moment where neither of them said anything. "Thank you," she said. Third time, fourth time. He'd lost count. "You already said that. I'll probably keep saying it." "Okay." She looked at the door. "I'm going to have a very hard few weeks ahead of me." "Probably. The Callaway is going to push back hard. He's going to make it ugly." "Sounds like it." She looked at him. "I meant what I said. I don't usually ask for help." A beat. "But I'm glad I knocked." Logan held the door. "You can knock again," he said, "if you need to." She seemed to file this away, not effusively, not with the kind of gratitude that becomes its own weight. Just received. She went across the hall. He heard her door lock. He went back inside, checked on Sophie, deep asleep, one arm over Peanut, and sat in the dark living room for a while with his coffee going cold on the table beside him. He thought about the way she'd looked when Sophie leaned into her on the couch. He thought about the honey he'd automatically put in her tea at midnight without thinking. He thought about 3 months of walking past apartment 1408 and thinking, not my business. Outside, the city was bright and wet and carrying on. Inside, the apartment was quiet in the way it usually was on Saturday nights, but a different kind of quiet than before, with the shape of the evening still in it. He sat there for a while, not thinking about much in particular. Then he picked up his cold coffee, took the cups to the kitchen, and went to bed. The week after the storm was ordinary in all the surface ways and completely different underneath. Victoria went back to her normal schedule, or what Logan gathered was her normal schedule, which meant he heard the elevator at 6:40 in the morning and didn't hear it come back until 9 or 10 at night, sometimes later. He knew this not because he was paying attention to it, but because he'd always been a light sleeper, and the sound of the elevator on their floor had been part of the building's ambient vocabulary long before he'd had any reason to connect it to the person across the hall. Now he did. He didn't know what to do with that, so he left it alone. Sophie asked about her twice that week. Once on Tuesday, during dinner, she said, "Is Victoria okay?" Without preamble, the way children ask questions that they've been sitting on for days. Logan told her yes, he thought so. Sophie nodded and went back to her pasta with the air of someone who had received acceptable information and filed it away. The second time was Thursday, when Sophie came home from school and dropped her backpack at the door and looked at the hallway for a second before looking at him. "She's not home," Logan said. "I wasn't going to knock," Sophie said. "Okay. I was just looking. I know." Sophie picked up her backpack. "She's probably very busy." "Probably." Logan thought about this exchange for a long time afterward. It was a Saturday morning, 10 days after the storm, when Victoria knocked on his door again. This time it was 8 in the morning, a civilized hour, and she was dry, and she was holding a brown paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks over. "I walk past it every morning," she said when he opened the door. "I never stop because I'm always—" She held up the bag. "I stopped today. Sophie likes those almond things. She mentioned them once in the elevator. I didn't know if I bought too many. I thought—" She stopped talking. Logan looked at her. She was in work clothes, the good kind, the kind that said, "I have a meeting today," but she had a look on her face like a person who'd been sitting on a decision and had finally made it without fully knowing what came next. "Sophie," he called over his shoulder, "someone's here." The sound of small feet hitting the floor at speed was immediate. "What?" They sat at the kitchen table with almond croissants and coffee, the three of them, and Sophie explained the situation at school with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to school politics. Specifically, the ongoing and complex issue of who was allowed to sit at which table during lunch, which had undergone a significant reorganization that week, with effects she was still processing. Victoria listened to this with complete attention. Logan watched her do it, the way she didn't half listen the way adults usually did with kids, letting their eyes drift or nodding at the wrong moments. She asked a follow-up question about a girl named Maya, who had apparently been the central figure in the table reorganization, and Sophie looked briefly stunned that anyone had retained the name. "Maya is complicated," Sophie explained. "Most people named Maya are," Victoria said. "Do you know someone named Maya?" "I knew a Maya in college who once sent an email meant for the whole department about a person she disliked, which was accidentally sent to the person she disliked. So yes, I understand the complicated Maya situation." Sophie considered this. "What happened?" "Awkward semester." Sophie nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone adding new information to an existing framework. Then she took another bite of her croissant and looked between the two of them in the way that Logan had come to recognize as the look she used when she was about to say something that she'd been thinking about for longer than the current conversation. "Are you two friends now?" she asked. Logan opened his mouth. "I think so," Victoria said at the same moment. She looked at him. He looked at her. He closed his mouth. "Good," Sophie said, apparently satisfied, and bit into her croissant. After Sophie went to her room to find something she absolutely had to show Victoria, a drawing, it turned out, the updated portrait of Peanut that had been reworked several times in the past week and was now significantly more anatomically accurate. Logan was alone in the kitchen with Victoria for about 90 seconds. "How are things?" he said. She understood what he meant. "Dana got everything organized. It's been submitted to outside counsel." She turned her coffee mug in a small circle. "Calloway has started making moves. He called an informal board call on Tuesday. I wasn't invited, which tells me everything." She looked at him. "He's going to try to get in front of the narrative. He's very good at that. He'll make it about my stability, my judgment. He's been laying the groundwork for that story for over a year." "What does that look like?" "Small things. Missed meetings, except I didn't miss them. They were rescheduled without notifying me. Decisions I apparently made erratically, except those decisions were made by him and attributed to me after the fact. A pattern that, if you only have his version, looks like a founder who's losing her grip on her own company." She said it without visible anger, which Logan had started to understand was its own kind of thing with her. She processed anger into analysis. It was efficient, and it was also a little sad. He's been careful. He's been patient. He's had a year. So what do you do? "I have a board meeting in 3 weeks. I need to get in front of 2 specific board members before then, Harriet Gould and Raymond Cross. They're not involved in any of this, I'm certain. But if Calloway gets to them first with his version," she shook her head. "I need Harriet to hear the truth from me with documentation before she hears the story from him. Can you do that?" "I'm working on it." She paused. "There's a fundraiser next Friday. Harriet will be there. I've been invited for 2 months. Calloway will also be there." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "It should be a lovely evening." Sophie reappeared with the Peanut portrait and a supplementary sketch of the building's lobby cat, a tabby named Biscuit who lived in the mailroom and whose legal status was semi-official. And the conversation about Marcus Calloway was set aside while Victoria examined both works with appropriate thoroughness. Logan watched from the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, and thought that whatever he'd expected from the woman across the hall, it hadn't been this. It hadn't been someone who remembered almond croissants and asked follow-up questions about 6-year-old school politics and knew how to look at a child's drawing the right way, with interest instead of performance. He thought about Claire, not in the heavy way, not with the familiar pull of grief that used to hit without warning in the early years. Just a thought, clean and honest. She would have liked her. He didn't know what to do with that either, so he left it alone too. Victoria started stopping by on weekends. Not every weekend, not by some established agreement. It was never discussed as a thing that was happening. She would knock on a Saturday morning or text. They'd exchange numbers the week after the storm, practically, saying she was going to the farmer's market down the street and asking if Sophie needed anything, because Sophie had apparently mentioned once that she liked the small apples that came in a paper bag from the stand on the corner. Or she'd arrive at the door on a Sunday afternoon because she'd made too much of something and didn't own enough storage containers. An explanation Logan found plausible but not entirely sufficient. He didn't examine it. Sophie was happy. The apartment felt different when she was in it. Not louder, not more complicated, just occupied in a fuller way. Logan had spent 4 years calibrating the space to exactly 2 people, and adding a third had an effect he hadn't anticipated, which was that it felt less careful. Like the rooms could afford to be slightly less tidy, slightly less deliberate. What he noticed about Victoria in those weekends wasn't the things he might have expected to notice about a billionaire doing something outside her natural habitat. He didn't notice awkwardness with domesticity or condescension about the apartment's modest size. What he noticed instead was how tired she was. Not in her performance, she was always, when she knocked on the door, put together in the functional sense. But in the moments between when Sophie was occupied and the adults were quiet, or when she was reading something on her phone with her coffee going cold beside her, or when the 3 of them watched some movie Sophie had selected, and Victoria let her head rest back on the couch and her face went entirely unguarded. The tiredness was structural. It wasn't from one bad week or one hard situation. It was the kind that came from years. He understood it. He recognized it in his own mirror some mornings. One Sunday, he came back from putting Sophie to bed and found Victoria standing at his living room window, looking at the street below, and she didn't hear him come in because she was that far inside her own thoughts. He stood there for a second, and she turned, and she had that look, the unguarded one, for just a moment before she brought the other expression back. "Sorry," she said. "For what?" She looked at the window. "I've been thinking about my mother." She said it with slight reluctance, like she'd started the sentence before she'd decided to. Logan sat in the chair. "Tell me." She looked at him for a second. Then she sat on the couch. "She died when I was 17, she said. "It was fast. She was sick, and then she was gone before I'd fully understood she was sick. And then it was just my father and me, and he was—" She paused. "He meant well. He was not good at grief. He responded by working, and then by working more. And I watched him do that, and I thought, I'll never do that. I'll never just disappear into something to avoid feeling things." She was quiet for a moment. "And then I started a company at 24, and I have basically not stopped since." "So, you didn't disappear," Logan said. "You built something." "Sometimes I'm not sure those are different things." She looked at her hands. "The problem is I'm good at it, the work. I'm genuinely good at it, and I love it. And I think that makes it easier to not notice when it's become the thing you use instead of the things you're supposed to be using." Logan thought about his own version of this. The years after Claire, when he'd been so focused on making sure Sophie was okay, school and food and routines and stability, that he'd almost forgotten to check on whether he was okay. Not that he'd had the luxury of checking, but still. "What do you want?" he asked. "Outside of the company." She looked at the question like it was slightly foreign. "I don't know," she said. "That's the honest answer." A short breath. "I know what I'm supposed to want. The profile pieces always include something about finding balance, and I say the right things. But in practice—" She stopped. "When did you last take a vacation?" 18 months ago. I was on a beach in Portugal, and I had 3 calls and rewrote a product brief on my phone. That's not a vacation. I know. When did you last do something that had nothing to do with work? Something that was only for you? She thought about it, and the fact that she had to think about it at all, that she was sitting there genuinely searching her recent memory for a single thing, said more than any answer she could have given. "I don't know," she said again, quieter this time. Logan looked at her. He wasn't sure what to say, so he said the thing that was true. "You seem less like a billionaire and more like a person who's been running for a really long time," he said, "and I think some part of you knocked on my door that night because you needed somewhere to stop for a minute." She was quiet. She was looking at the middle distance again. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in years," she said finally. "Well," he picked up his coffee. "I'm not good at a lot of things, but I'm good at noticing when someone's tired." She looked at him. There was something in her face, not the warmth of the moment with Sophie and not the careful composure she wore to work, but something in between, something that didn't have a clean name. "You're good at more things than you think," she said. He didn't answer that. He took a drink of his coffee and looked at the window and let it be. The trouble started on a Wednesday. Logan was at work. He ran a small residential renovation crew, 2 guys and himself. The kind of work that kept him moving and tired and good at measuring things. When he got a text from a number he didn't recognize. No greeting, no context, just a photograph. The photograph was of his building's lobby. He could see the mailboxes on the left wall, the marble floor, the door to the stairwell. In the foreground, there was a man he'd never seen, mid-40s, dark coat, standing near the elevator with his phone raised, looking at something. The text below the photograph said, "They've identified her location, building under observation. She needs to know." Logan stood in the middle of the half-gutted kitchen of a house in the Riverside district and looked at his phone. Then he texted Victoria. "Call me when you can. Not urgent, but soon." She called in 4 minutes. "Someone sent me a photo," he said, keeping his voice level because one of his guys, Derek, was 10 feet away pulling copper pipe. "Of our lobby. They said someone's watching the building." Silence on her end. Then, "When?" "Just now. Unknown number." "Forward it to me." A pause. "The number." "Send me the number too." He forwarded both. He could hear the shift in her breathing, the way it became more controlled. "It might be nothing," she said. "Yeah. But it might not be." "I know." Another pause. "I'll make some calls. Can you—" She stopped herself. "Sophie gets out at 3:15, he said. "I pick her up every day. Same route." "Okay, I don't think, I don't want you to—" She was choosing her words carefully, which was not entirely like her. "This isn't your situation. I don't want you pulled into it." "Little late for that," he said. She didn't respond to that immediately. He could hear traffic through her phone, a door opening and closing. "I'm going to find out who sent you that photo," she said. "And I'm going to find out how they got your number." "Okay?" "Logan." She said his name with an intention behind it. "Thank you for calling me immediately." "Yeah," he said. "That's what people do." He could hear her hesitate on that, the way someone hesitates when they've been given something simple and aren't sure how to receive it cleanly. He said goodbye and went back to the copper pipe. The person who'd sent the photo turned out to be a security analyst named Torres, who worked for a private firm that Victoria had quietly hired 3 weeks ago to monitor certain activities around Hale Systems. Torres had picked up Logan's number through a routine check of Victoria's communication records, which was, as Victoria explained that evening in his kitchen, deeply problematic and something she was having a conversation with Torres's firm about. But also, in this specific instance, the reason Logan now had a heads up that someone was watching the building. "So someone is watching," Logan said. "A driver. He's been logged twice in the past week, different vehicles, same face. He's not doing anything aggressive, just sitting." She turned her coffee mug. "It's a pressure move. Calloway wants me to know I'm being watched. He wants me nervous." "Is it working?" She considered this with the honesty that had started to be a consistent quality of her in his presence. "A little," she said. "I'm human." Sophie was at the table doing homework, 2nd grade math, which involved counting illustrated objects and writing numbers, which Sophie did with the determined focus of someone not to be interrupted, and the conversation in the kitchen was kept at a volume that didn't carry. Logan leaned against the counter and watched Victoria work through whatever calculus she was running behind her eyes. "The fundraiser is in 3 days, she said. "Harriet Gould is going. If I can get 15 minutes with her privately, not in front of Calloway or any of his people, I can change the shape of this entire situation. What do you need?" "I need to get there without being photographed arriving alone, which his people will use to reinforce the stability narrative. And I need someone who—" She stopped. Logan looked at her. "Are you asking me to come with you to a fundraiser?" She looked at the table for a second, which was the nearest thing to flustered he'd seen from her. It would be as a friend, it's not, I'm not asking you to. When is it? Friday, 7 o'clock. She looked at him. I know that's not your world. What kind of fundraiser? Technology education nonprofit. It's a seated dinner. There will be approximately 200 people in suits talking about things you will find tedious. Sounds great. Logan, I'll need someone for Sophie. He was already thinking through it. Mrs. Toronto down the hall had watched Sophie twice before, both times without issue. That should be fine. Victoria watched him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at her directly. You've been dealing with this alone for weeks. You asked me once. This is me asking you to let me. She was quiet for a moment. The sound of Sophie counting aloud to herself drifted from the table. 7 o'clock, Victoria said. I'll be ready. The suit he owned was from his brother's wedding 4 years ago, and it still fit in the way that suits fit when you've lived on the same physical routine for years. Not great, not bad. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror on Friday evening and thought about the last time he'd worn it, which had been the wedding, which had been 6 months after Claire's accident, which meant he'd spent the entire ceremony in this suit running on about 3 hours of sleep and the particular hollow competence of someone who'd been functioning on autopilot for half a year. He danced with Sophie at the reception. She'd been too, wobbly on her feet but willing, and his brother had found him at the bar afterward and said, "You're doing good, Logan," and meant it sincerely, and Logan had almost believed him. He put the jacket on, straightened the collar, and went to knock on 1408. Victoria opened the door and she looked. He'd seen the magazine photographs. He'd seen her in work clothes, in sweatpants, in the careful morning presentability of someone who'd slept 4 hours but would never let it be apparent. This was different. The dress was dark blue, simple, not flashy, and she wore it the way people wear things when they're completely comfortable in them, which was its own kind of quiet. Her hair was up. She was wearing earrings that caught the hallway light. She looked at him. He looked at her. You look good, she said. You look like a magazine cover, he said. I'll take that as a compliment. It was one. She grabbed a small bag from the table by the door and pulled the door shut behind her. They stood in the hallway, same carpet, same faint smell of Mrs. Toronto's cooking. But it felt different, the way ordinary spaces feel different when you see them from slightly outside yourself. Ready? She said. No, he said honestly, but let's go. She laughed, an actual laugh, short and surprised, and he caught the edge of it and felt something shift in his chest in a way he recognized dimly and then immediately put away. They walked to the elevator together. The fundraiser was everything Victoria had described, and several things she hadn't mentioned. The room was full of people who knew each other in the complicated way that money creates familiarity, first names and practiced warmth, and the constant small-scale calculations of who was standing next to whom and what it meant. Logan stood at Victoria's side through the first 45 minutes of cocktails and navigation and introductions, shook hands with people whose names he forgot immediately, smiled at things that weren't quite jokes, and spent most of his mental energy watching the room the way he'd learned to watch buildings before renovation, looking for the load-bearing structures, the things that were holding everything up. He spotted Marcus Calloway 20 minutes in, without being told who he was. Tall, probably 50, the kind of handsome that had been better at 40, standing near the bar with two men who had the posture of people who worked for him. He was laughing at something. He looked relaxed in the way that predators look relaxed. Not because they're not paying attention, but because they've already identified everything in the room. Calloway spotted Victoria within seconds of their arrival. Logan saw it happen. Calloway's eyes moved across the room, found her, and then moved to Logan with a brief assessment that was over in less than a second. Then Calloway smiled and looked away. He saw you, Logan said quietly. He was going to. Victoria kept her posture easy, her face social. It's fine. I expected that. The question is whether he gets to Harriet before I do. She was scanning the room with the practiced casualness of someone who'd been doing this for years. There, by the windows. Harriet Gould was somewhere in her late 60s, silver-haired, small, with the look of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had made a career out of the differential. She was speaking to a younger woman Logan didn't recognize. "I need about 10 minutes, Victoria said. "Without him in eyeline." "Go," Logan said. "I'll handle the eyeline." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means go talk to Harriet. I'll figure out the rest." What Logan did was not complicated. He simply moved to the bar and positioned himself in Marcus Calloway's sightline. And when Calloway inevitably looked toward the windows to track Victoria's movement, Logan was in the way. And Logan made eye contact, held it for a second, and then ordered 2 drinks with the deliberate patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. Calloway looked away. Logan moved slightly left. Calloway's attention was occupied by the man to his right. Logan tracked Victoria peripherally. She'd reached Harriet, they were speaking. The younger woman had stepped away. It wasn't covert. It wasn't complex. It was just the particular competence of someone who was good at being in a room without being noticed, which was a different skill from being invisible, but equally useful. 12 minutes later, Victoria appeared at his elbow, took the drink he handed her, and looked at the wall across the room with a carefully neutral expression. "How did it go?" he said, not looking at her. "Better than I hoped," she said, the same careful neutrality. "She wants documentation by Monday. She's going to contact Raymond Cross." "That's what you needed?" "That's what I needed." Logan took a drink. Across the room, Marcus Calloway was now watching them. Not aggressively, just watching, the way a chess player watches a piece that's moved unexpectedly. "He's looking at us," Logan said. "I know." Victoria turned, met Calloway's gaze across the room, held it for a second, and then looked away with the absolute indifference of someone who has decided a person is beneath their attention. It was a surgical move, and she executed it without apparent effort. "Let's get dinner." They sat across from each other at a table with 6 other people whose conversation was mostly about things Logan knew nothing about and couldn't follow. And he ate the first course and listened and occasionally answered the direct questions that came his way. "What do you do? How do you know Victoria?" With the simplest available truth: renovation contractor, neighbors. Both answers produced the same brief recalibration in whoever asked, the small visible adjustment that people make when the information doesn't fit the category they'd assumed. Victoria watched this happen from across the table, and she had that look again, the one he was starting to be able to read, the one that said she was finding something quietly funny in a way she wasn't going to name. During the 3rd course, she leaned across the table slightly. "You moved into his line of sight on purpose," she said, low, under the table conversation. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You blocked his view for 12 minutes. I was getting drinks." "Logan." He looked at her. "Did it work?" She held his gaze. "Yes." "Then it doesn't matter how I did it." She leaned back. Under the table noise and candlelight and the 100 social calculations of the room around them, she looked at him with something that had passed through warmth into something with more weight to it, and Logan felt it land somewhere he hadn't been expecting. He looked back at his plate. They took a cab home. The city was wet and bright outside the windows, October doing its reliable thing, and neither of them talked much on the way back. Not from tension. The silence was easy, the kind that comes between 2 people who've spent enough small hours together to not require constant filling. In the elevator, Victoria looked at the numbers and said, "Thank you." "You've said that more than anyone I've ever met." "Because I mean it more than I've ever meant it." He looked at her. She was looking at the elevator doors. "You've been doing everything yourself for a long time," he said. "Yes." "You don't have to." She was quiet for a second. "I'm not sure I know how to do it differently," she said. "You knocked on my door," he said. "That's different." She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that he didn't let himself hold for too long because he could feel exactly where that road went, and he wasn't ready to think about it clearly. The elevator opened. They walked down the hallway. At the point of divergence, they stopped. "Good night," she said. "Good night." She went to 1408. He went to 1407. Sophie was asleep, and Mrs. Toronto had left a note that said, "Good child," ate all her dinner, and was gone. Logan stood in the hallway of his apartment, still in the suite, and looked at the closed front door. Outside, somewhere in the building's pipes, the familiar rattle started up. Someone's bath, the east wall, the sound he'd been hearing for 2 years. He'd mapped every sound this building made. He knew its vocabulary by heart. But the thing with familiar places, he was starting to understand, was that you could live in them for years and still find out they contained rooms you hadn't opened. He took off the jacket and hung it up and went to check on his daughter. And he didn't think about anything in particular, and he left the rest of it for tomorrow. The documentation reached Harriet Gould on Monday morning, delivered by Donna in the same quiet, efficient way that Dana did everything. By Monday afternoon, Harriet had contacted Raymond Cross. By Tuesday, Cross had contacted the outside law firm that handled Hale Systems' independent audit function. None of this was visible from the outside. Calloway went on doing what Calloway did: the informal conversations, the carefully placed doubts, the steady work of making Victoria look like a founder who had lost her footing. He had no reason to believe anything had changed. Victoria knew this because Torres's firm was now monitoring his communications through legal channels that Dana had established over the previous 2 weeks. She told Logan about it on Tuesday evening, standing in his kitchen while Sophie ate dinner, keeping her voice low and her face the way she kept her face when Sophie was in the room. Easy, unthreatening, the particular mode she'd developed in the weeks of Saturday mornings and almond croissants and peanut updates. "He thinks he's ahead," she said. "He's been ahead for a year. It's the only position he knows how to operate from." "What happens when he realizes he's not?" She turned her coffee mug once. "He panics," she said, "and panicked people do things they wouldn't do otherwise." Logan looked at her. "That's what you're counting on." "I'm counting on him overreacting," she said, with a precision that he'd stopped finding cold and started finding just honest. "He'll move too fast. He'll reach for something he shouldn't reach for, and when he does, we'll have it." "We," Sophie said from the table, without looking up from her plate. They both looked at her. "That's a team word," Sophie explained, still eating. "Ms. Patterson says we use team words when we're working together." Victoria looked at Logan. Logan looked at the ceiling briefly. "Yes," Victoria said. "Team word. You're right." Sophie nodded and returned to her dinner, satisfied. But the board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday, 2 weeks out. The 2 weeks were not quiet. Calloway moved faster than Victoria had anticipated, which meant the panic had already started before she'd expected it. A story appeared in a financial blog on Wednesday, sourced anonymously, attributed to people close to the Hale Systems board, describing a founder who had become increasingly erratic, who had missed critical decisions, who had, according to these unnamed sources, been behaving strangely for months. The language was careful and technically unprovable. It was also clearly Calloway's work, or Calloway's people's work, which was the same thing. Victoria saw it at 6 in the morning and texted Logan one line: "It started." He read it at 6:12, standing in the kitchen in his old t-shirt and jeans while the coffee brewed. He typed back, "How bad?" Her response took a few minutes. "Bad enough to matter. Not bad enough to be decisive. He's testing the water." He sent, "What do you need today?" Another pause. Then, "Nothing yet. I'll let you know." He put his phone down and poured his coffee and stood at the window looking at the city in the early morning light, gray and ordinary, the streets below still quiet. He thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago, he'd been the man who didn't know the first name of his neighbor across the hall. He turned that fact over the way you turn a stone over, not because you expect to find something under it, but because you want to see all its sides. Then Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair going in 4 directions, dragging Peanut by one thinning ear, and the morning took over. The week folded badly. The financial blog piece got picked up by 2 larger outlets, neither of them reputable exactly, but both with enough reach to circulate. The language evolved slightly in each retelling. Erratic became unstable, the unnamed sources multiplied, and a photograph of Victoria from 6 months ago outside the company's headquarters, taken by someone with a long lens and sold to a photo agency, ran alongside the third piece with a caption that described her as facing internal pressure from within her own company's leadership. Dana sent Logan a text on Friday. He hadn't expected her to have his number, but apparently she did, which was only slightly unsettling. That said, She's not sleeping. She won't say that, but I'm telling you. Logan texted back. Thanks for telling me. He knocked on 1408 that evening. Victoria took a moment to answer, which told him something. When she opened the door, she was in work clothes she'd clearly been in since morning, hair half out of whatever she'd put it in that day, and she had the look of someone running on the wrong kind of fuel. Too much caffeine, not enough of anything else. Have you eaten? He said. Today? Come have dinner. I'm in the middle of it. Victoria. She stopped. He was using the specific tone he used with Sophie when Sophie was about to argue about something that didn't have room for argument. And he was aware of using it, and he watched her become aware of it too, and he watched something in her resist and then not. Give me 5 minutes, she said. She came across the hall and sat at his table and ate the pasta he made because pasta was what he had. And Sophie told her about the week at school, which had involved a science project about weather and a dispute about whose clay model of a cloud was better, a dispute Sophie clearly still felt strongly about. And Victoria listened and weighed in judiciously and ate the pasta, and some of the color came back to her face in the gradual way that food does that for people who've forgotten to eat. After Sophie was in bed, Victoria stayed at the table with her coffee, and Logan stayed across from her, and they didn't talk for a little while, which was something they'd both gotten comfortable with. He's trying to wear me down, she said eventually. Is it working? A little. She looked at her mug. The thing about a sustained campaign like this is that even when you know exactly what it is and why it's happening, it still has an effect. You start to read everything twice. You wonder if you're seeing things clearly or if you're too close to it. She shook her head. He knows that. He's counting on it. What does Dana think? Dana thinks I should hit back publicly, get in front of the narrative with a statement. She turned the mug. I don't want to do that. Anything I say publicly right now plays into the instability story. A founder defending herself against anonymous sources looks like a founder who's rattled. Are you rattled? She met his eyes. Yes, she said. But that's different from being wrong. Then don't defend yourself to anonymous sources, he said. Defend yourself to the board. She was quiet for a moment. The board meeting is in 10 days, she said. I just have to get to 10 days. You'll get there. She looked at him with the direct, assessing look she used when she was trying to figure out how much of what someone said was politeness and how much was real. You don't actually know that, she said. No, he agreed. But I've watched you manage this for weeks, and you haven't made a wrong move yet. I've made several wrong moves. Name one that mattered. She thought about it. The fact that she had to think about it was the answer. Sleep, he said. That's what you need. Everything else can wait 8 hours. She looked at him for a moment. You're bossy, she said. Not unkindly. I have a 6-year-old. I've been practicing. She pushed back her chair and stood. He walked her to the door, and in the hallway outside 1407, she turned, and for a second, she just looked at him. The hallway light was the same yellow it always was. The carpet ran its faded pattern. 14 floors of ordinary building noise settling around them. I don't know what I would have done without you these past weeks, she said. I want you to know that. You'd have figured it out. Probably, she said, but I didn't have to. She held his gaze for a moment. That matters. That's the part that matters. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he said goodnight, and she went across the hall, and he stood in his own doorway until he heard her lock click, and then he went inside. The board meeting was a Thursday at 10 in the morning in a glass conference room on the 22nd floor of the Hale Systems Tower. Logan knew this because Victoria had described it to him on Wednesday evening, not the meeting itself, but the building. How the 22nd floor had been built with floor-to-ceiling windows specifically because the company's first major investor had believed that natural light was the single most reliable indicator of a company's culture. And Victoria had thought that was mostly nonsense, but had kept the windows anyway because the investor had been right about 8 other things. He was at a job in the Riverside district that morning, running his crew through the second phase of the kitchen renovation, when his phone buzzed with a text from Dana at 9:52. He's doing it now. Meeting is starting early. She needs you. Can you get to the tower? Logan looked at his phone. He looked at Derek, who was measuring a run of tile with the focused patience of someone who had found his purpose in life. "Derek," he said, "can you handle the morning?" Derek looked up. "Everything okay?" "Probably," Logan said. "Give me a few hours." He'd gotten the address from Victoria weeks ago. In a passing context he couldn't even remember now, but he'd retained it the way he retained things he might need. The Hale Systems Tower was downtown, a 40-minute drive in normal traffic, 25 on a Thursday morning if you moved with intent. He made it in 32. He didn't know exactly what he was doing. He had, on his phone, a folder of photographs that Victoria had sent him 2 weeks prior. Not the formal documentation that was in Dana's hands, and had been for weeks, but a secondary set of records she'd compiled as a backup. She'd sent them to him because she'd said, the night she sent them, "If something happens and I can't access anything else, I need these to exist somewhere outside the company's reach." He downloaded them without asking many questions, and they'd been sitting in a folder on his phone called Renovation Specs Q4 because Victoria had been somewhat darkly amused by that title, and he'd liked that she found it funny. He didn't know if those photographs were what Dana meant. He texted Dana from the parking structure. "What does she need?" Dana's reply came fast. "Calloway has called an emergency session with 3 board members. He's presenting a motion to place her on administrative leave, pending a mental competency review." He got to the room first. "She doesn't have her outside counsel here yet. They're 20 minutes out. She's alone in there right now." Logan sat in his truck in the parking structure for about 4 seconds. Then he got out. The lobby of the Hale Systems Tower was the kind of lobby that had been designed to communicate scale. High ceilings, a reception desk made of something that was either marble or a convincing composite. The company logo raised and backlit on the far wall. Logan walked through it with the particular pace of someone who knows where they're going and has no intention of explaining themselves to anyone who asks. Security stopped him at the elevator bank. A young man in a gray uniform, polite, doing his job. "I need a visitor badge, sir. Do you have an appointment?" "I'm here to see Victoria Hale." "Is she expecting you?" Logan looked at the man. "She will be." The guard reached for his phone. Logan reached for his own and called Dana, who picked up on the first ring. He handed his phone to the security guard and watched the guard's expression change over the course of about 15 seconds, from official protocol to something more cooperative. 22nd floor, the guard said, handing Logan back his phone. Logan took his badge and got in the elevator. Yet, he heard Calloway before he saw the room. The voice carried, deep, measured, the kind of voice that had been used in conference rooms for decades and knew exactly what it was doing. Logan could hear it through the glass before he reached the door. The words not fully distinct, but the cadence unmistakable. The pacing of an argument being delivered for effect, not information. Through the glass he could see the room. 7 people around the table. Calloway at one end, standing. 3 board members Logan didn't know. Dana, against the wall with her phone in her hand and her expression controlled. One man Logan hadn't seen before, who had the look of Calloway's counsel. And at the far end of the table, Victoria. She was sitting. She was not performing ease, she was actually composed, which was different, and he could see the difference from outside the glass because he'd spent weeks learning what composed actually looked like on her face versus what performed composed looked like. She was listening. Her hands were flat on the table, but she was one person against 6 who had taken the room first. Logan opened the door. Every head turned. Calloway's voice stopped mid-sentence. Logan walked in the way he walked into buildings he was about to work on, without ceremony, looking at the structure. He pulled out the chair beside Victoria and sat in it. He put his phone on the table. "Sorry I'm late," he said to no one in particular. Victoria looked at him. Something moved across her face. Surprise, relief, and then the particular expression that came after both of those. The one that looked like a person who had been holding a wall up by themselves and has just felt a second pair of hands on it. "Who is this?" Calloway said. He was looking at Logan with the assessment that Logan had seen at the fundraiser, the same fast categorization. "Logan Pierce," Logan said. "I'm a friend of Victoria's." "This is a private board session. You're not..." I'm also holding secondary documentation of the financial irregularities your CFO signed off on between January and July of last year, Logan said conversationally, if that's relevant to today's discussion. The room changed temperature. Calloway looked at the phone on the table. His eyes moved to Victoria. She was watching him with the same expression she'd used at the fundraiser when she'd looked across the room at him, absolute, considered indifference. But Logan could see the set of her jaw, and he knew it was costing her something. "This is a board session," Calloway said again, but the command had left the sentence. "You have no standing here." "I'm not here to have standing," Logan said. "I'm here to sit next to my friend while she waits for her outside counsel, who will be here in—" He looked at Dana. 14 minutes, Dana said from the wall. 14 minutes, Logan said. "We can all wait together." Harriet Gould, at the middle of the table, was looking at Logan with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between assessment and something more like recognition. She'd been at the fundraiser. She'd had 12 minutes with Victoria by a window. She was one of 2 people in this room who had seen the documentation Dana had sent Monday morning. She leaned back in her chair. "Marcus," she said, in the tone of a woman who had used that tone in rooms like this before, "I think we should wait for outside counsel before we proceed." "Harriet." "That's my position." She folded her hands. "Raymond?" Raymond Cross, to her left, said, "Agreed." Calloway stood at the end of the table. Logan watched his face. He'd described it to Victoria, the panicked person reaching for something they shouldn't reach for. And it was happening now, not in a dramatic way, but in the particular micro-expressions of a man recalibrating fast and badly, the eyes moving between the board members, calculating, finding the math wrong. "This is irregular," Calloway said. "This entire situation is irregular. The documentation Victoria has been circulating has been reviewed by outside counsel since Monday," Victoria said. It was the first thing she'd said since Logan sat down. She said it quietly, without triumph, the way you state a fact that has already been true for several days. Calloway looked at her. Logan watched the moment when the man understood that the timeline he'd been operating on was not the actual timeline. "You've already—" Calloway started. "Yes," Victoria said. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the floor-to-ceiling windows that the first investor had insisted on, the city did its ordinary Thursday morning thing. The distant motion of traffic, the flat November sky, someone's crane swinging in a slow arc over a construction site several blocks east. Logan kept his hands flat on the table and said nothing, and watched Calloway do the math a second time and get the same answer. Outside counsel arrived in 11 minutes, not 14. Dana had been inaccurate by 3 minutes in a direction that suited everyone except Calloway. The next 2 hours were not neat. Logan sat through most of them at the back of the room, his original chair now given to a woman named Priya, who was outside counsel's lead on the financial irregularities case. He stood against the wall the way Dana had stood. Present, peripheral, there. Calloway had a lawyer of his own, a man named Briggs, who was good at delay and procedure, and who spent the first 40 minutes working those tools with professional competence. He challenged the provenance of the documentation. He challenged the process by which it had been obtained. He challenged whether the meeting had been properly constituted. Harriet Gould's expression through all of this was the specific expression of a woman who had been patient her entire career precisely in order to be impatient at the right moment. When Briggs finished, she said, "I've reviewed the documentation. Raymond has reviewed the documentation. We've had outside counsel review the documentation. The question before this board is not procedural." She looked at Calloway directly. "Marcus, the question is whether you'd like to address the specific transactions outlined in the January through July records, or whether you'd prefer to wait until this is a criminal matter." Briggs put a hand on Calloway's arm. Calloway shook it off. "This is a setup," Calloway said. "This entire thing has been—" "Marcus!" Harriet's voice was not loud. "Stop talking." He stopped. The room was quiet again. Logan looked at Victoria. She was looking at the table in front of her, not at Calloway, not performing anything, just settled. The way something settles when it finally lands. "I'd like to call a 10-minute recess," Priya said. Harriet nodded. People stood, shifted, moved toward the doors. Calloway and Briggs moved to the corner of the room and had a conversation that involved Briggs doing most of the talking, and Calloway looking at the window with the expression of a man who was counting the number of available exits. Victoria came to where Logan was standing. She didn't say anything right away. She stood next to him, and they both looked at the room. "You came," she said finally. Dana texted. "I told her not to." She stopped. "I told her I could handle it." "You were handling it," he said. "I just sat down." She looked at him. "You put documentation on the table." "You put documentation on the table 3 weeks ago. I just held a copy." Logan. "Yeah." She was quiet for a second. "Thank you feels inadequate," she said. "Then don't say it." "But it's all I have right now." He looked at the window. The crane was still moving in its slow arc outside. "Then say it when it's not inadequate," he said. "For now, just go finish this." She was quiet for another moment. Then she straightened her jacket and walked back toward the table. The formal session reconvened and lasted another 90 minutes. Logan didn't stay for all of it. He stepped out at the 90-minute mark and went down to the lobby and texted Derek to check the tile measurements, and then sat in the lobby with a coffee from the building's ground floor cafe, which was decent and cost twice what he'd normally pay. But he was downtown, and that was apparently the fee. Dana texted at 1:14. "Board has voted. Calloway and 2 others are being referred to the audit committee and outside criminal counsel. Victoria retains all authority. It's done." Logan looked at the text. He finished his coffee. He sat there for a few minutes looking at the lobby. The high ceiling, the backlit logo, the security guard who had looked at him carefully an hour ago and was now not looking at him at all. He thought about a parking garage on a rainy night, and a woman deciding to take the service exit instead of the elevator, and a cab to a hotel 2 blocks from their building, and a knock on his door at 12:14 in the morning that he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined. He thought about almond croissants and an elephant named Peanut and a kid who looked at everything like it was worth investigating. He thought about the hallway between 1407 and 1408, which he'd walked 1,000 times, and which had, at some point in the last 2 months, become a different kind of distance. Victoria appeared in the lobby at 1:45. She was with Dana and Priya and one of the board members Logan didn't know, and they were talking, and then they weren't, and the others peeled off toward the elevator, and Victoria crossed the lobby toward him. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just put it down and hadn't fully figured out what her body was going to do now that the weight was gone. She sat in the chair across from him. "It's done?" he said. "It's done," she exhaled. "There'll be a formal criminal referral by the end of the week. Calloway and 2 CFO-level executives. The 2 board members involved will be removed." She looked at her hands. "It's not over. There'll be months of this. Legal proceedings, public statements, the company's stock is going to have a bad week." She looked up. "But it's done." Logan looked at her. "You okay?" he said. She thought about it with the honesty she always brought to the question when he asked it directly. "Not yet," she said. "But I will be." "Good enough." She looked at him for a long moment. The lobby noise moved around them. Elevator bells, the security desk phone, a group of people crossing toward the exit. None of it quite reached them. "You know what the worst part is?" she said. "What?" "Marcus was the one who convinced me to take the CFO to Austin 8 years ago. Before the company was worth anything, when I was still half convinced the whole thing was going to fall apart." She looked at the floor. "He had good judgment then. He had integrity then. Or I thought he did. And somewhere in the middle of all that success, he just..." She stopped. "I don't know. He decided he wanted more than he'd built. More than he'd earned. People do that." "I know." She shook her head slightly. "I keep thinking, what's the exact moment? When does it shift? When does a person decide that what they've built isn't enough and what someone else built should be theirs?" Logan thought about this honestly. "I don't think it's one moment," he said. "I think it's a lot of small ones. And by the time you'd notice it from the outside, it's already been happening for years." She looked at him. "Is that from experience?" "Different circumstances," he said. "But yeah." She nodded slowly. She wasn't going to ask him to explain it, which was one of the things about her. She received things at the depth they were offered and didn't push for more. "I need to call Sophie," she said. He blinked. "I need to—" She stopped, looked faintly surprised at herself. "I want to tell her it's okay. That's—" She shook her head. "That's a strange impulse?" Logan looked at her. "Is it?" She held his gaze for a second and then looked away, out through the lobby's glass doors at the November street. "She's going to want to know," Victoria said. "She asked me about it on Saturday. She said, 'Are you still in trouble?' And I said a little, and she said, 'Well, Logan will fix it,' like it was obvious." Logan was quiet for a second. "She said that?" "Verbatim." The corner of her mouth moved. 6 years old and completely confident. He looked at the ceiling briefly. "She has very high expectations of me," he said. "I've told her multiple times I'm just a contractor." "She doesn't believe you." "I know." He pulled out his phone and dialed. It rang twice before Sophie picked up. She was at the after-school program, and he could hear the particular background chaos of a room full of children who had been sitting still all day and were no longer required to. "Hi, Daddy," she said loudly over the noise. "Hey, Bug, can you say hi to someone?" A pause, then, "Is it Victoria?" "Yeah." The sound that followed was difficult to categorize. Something between a small exclamation and an exhale of deep satisfaction, like a child who has been proven right about something. Logan handed the phone across the table. Victoria took it, and Logan watched her face as Sophie launched into whatever she was saying, the composure breaking down into something that didn't have armor, something unguarded and warm and slightly overwhelmed. And the city did its Thursday thing outside the glass, and the lobby moved around them, and Logan sat there and thought, this is real now. Whatever this is, it's real. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He sat with it anyway. They drove back to the Caldwell building together in a cab because Victoria's car was with her driver and Logan's truck was still in the parking structure. The ride was quiet, in the way the cab had been quiet on the night of the fundraiser. Easy, nothing required. At some point in the middle of the ride, Victoria looked out the window at the city and said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about running." He waited. "I think you were right," she said. "I think some part of me knocked on your door because I needed to stop." She was still looking out the window. "And I think I'm going to have to figure out what it looks like to not run. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know that this—" She gestured vaguely, which he understood to mean all of it. The almond croissants and the kitchen table and the board meeting and the phone call from a 6-year-old who had been waiting to hear everything was okay. "This is what I want it to look like." Logan looked at the back of the cab seat. "Okay," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him. The word had surprised her. She'd expected something more careful, something hedged. He hadn't given her that, and she was still deciding what it meant. "Okay," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "We'll figure out the rest." She looked at him for a long moment. The cab moved through the city. November outside the window, the streets catching what light was left in the afternoon. "Okay," she said. They didn't talk the rest of the way home. It wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. It was the kind that comes after something has been said and both people are letting it settle into the space between them, like a piece of furniture you've moved into a room and are standing back to look at, deciding whether it belongs. Logan thought it belonged. He left that alone for now, too. The Hale Systems stock dropped 6% on Friday morning, the day after the board meeting, which was less than Dana had projected and more than Victoria had hoped for. By the following Wednesday, it had recovered 4 of those points. By the end of the month, the financial press had largely moved from the instability narrative to a different one. Founder outmaneuvers executive coup. Sources say criminal referral imminent. And that version, while uncomfortable in its own way, was at least pointed in the right direction. Logan followed none of this closely. He got the broad strokes from Victoria, in the evenings at his kitchen table or in passing in the hallway, and he understood the shape of it without needing the detail. The company was stabilizing. The legal process was grinding forward with the specific slow certainty of legal processes when the documentation is solid. Callaway had retained 2 defense attorneys, and had not been seen at the Hale Systems Tower since the Thursday of the board meeting. The CFO had taken a leave of absence that everyone understood to be permanent. The thing Logan noticed in the weeks after was that Victoria slept. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone performing recovery, but the elevator, which had been running at 6:40 in the morning and returning at 9 or 10 at night, started coming back earlier. 9 o'clock, 8:30. Once, on a Tuesday at 7:15, and Logan had been in the kitchen when he heard it and had looked at the wall between the apartments like it had said something unexpected. She was still working constantly. That wasn't different. What was different was that the work seemed to have stopped consuming all available oxygen. There was air left around it. She said something about this herself one Saturday morning in early December, sitting at his kitchen table with both hands around her coffee, while Sophie was in the other room engaged in an elaborate project involving Peanut, several other stuffed animals, and what appeared to be a legal dispute over territory. Victoria had been listening to the proceedings with one ear and talking to Logan with the other. "I've been thinking about the company differently," she said. He waited. "For years, I've thought about it the way you think about something you built with your hands, something that's yours, personally. That if it fails, you fail. That every threat to it is a threat to you." She looked at her coffee. "And then the thing that was supposed to break it turned out to be the thing that showed me it wasn't fragile the way I thought it was. The company survived 3 executives being removed in a week. It kept functioning. The product teams kept shipping. The clients didn't leave." She looked up. "I think I'd been holding it together by sheer force of will for so long that I'd stopped noticing it could hold itself." "You built it to hold itself," Logan said. "I know, but knowing that and feeling it are different things." She turned the mug in its small circle. "I've been carrying something I didn't need to carry as heavily as I was carrying it. What are you going to do about it?" She considered. "Hire differently? Rebuild the executive team with people who aren't trying to own the thing they're managing." A short pause. "And start using the word we more, like Ms. Patterson apparently recommends." Logan looked at her. "Sophie told you about Ms. Patterson's thing?" "Sophie tells me everything," Victoria said. "She's very forthcoming." "I've noticed." From the other room, Sophie's voice rose with sudden judicial authority. "Peanut, you cannot claim the whole bed. That is not how territory works." Victoria pressed her lips together. Logan looked at the ceiling. "She's going to be terrifying when she grows up," Victoria said. "She's already terrifying," Logan said. "I live with her." The criminal referral against Calloway became official in the second week of December, announced in a press statement from the outside counsel's office that Victoria had approved word by word with Priya on a Tuesday afternoon. Logan read it when Dana forwarded it to him, which Dana did apparently as a matter of course now, and he thought the language was measured and correct and probably cost someone a lot of hours to get right. That evening, Victoria came across the hall, and she wasn't carrying anything this time, no croissant bag or storage container of leftovers, and she stood in his doorway, and she looked like someone who had just exhaled for the first time in a very long time. "It's official," she said. "I know, Dana sent it." She looked faintly exasperated. "Dana sends you everything. She started a few weeks ago." "I know. I told her to." Logan looked at her. She looked back without explaining it further, which was its own kind of explanation. "Come in," he said. Sophie was at the table doing homework. The multiplication tables had arrived in second grade like an unwelcome guest, and Sophie was wrestling with the sixes with the grim determination of someone who had not yet made peace with the arbitrary nature of math. She looked up when Victoria came in, assessed the situation, and returned to her worksheet. 6 times 7, Victoria said, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. She'd started doing that a few weeks ago, hanging her coat there like it was her hook, which he hadn't said anything about. Sophie looked up. 42, she said. Right. I knew that one. Sophie looked back down. It's the 8s that are bad. The 8s are bad for everyone, Victoria said. I still count them sometimes. Sophie looked up again. You do? When no one's watching. Sophie appeared to find this profoundly comforting. She went back to her worksheet with slightly more confidence than before. Victoria sat at the table and Logan made tea, the honey one, automatically, without thinking about it, the way he'd made it the first night. And they sat in the kitchen while Sophie worked through the sixes and the sevens and got stuck on 8 times 8 and asked for help, and both adults said 64 at the same time, and Sophie looked between them with the expression of a person whose world has just become slightly more orderly. Later, after Sophie was in bed, they sat in the living room and Victoria said, "I want to tell you something." He waited. "When I was building the company, in the early years, in Austin, I had a partner, not a business partner, someone I was with." She looked at the middle distance. His name was Calloway. Logan was very still. "Marcus," she said. "We were together for 3 years, from when I was 24 to 27. He was one of the first people I hired. I trusted him completely, professionally, personally, completely." She picked up her tea. "We ended badly. Not dramatically, just I chose the company over everything else, and he was patient about it for a while. And then he wasn't. And by the time we stopped being together, it had been over for a year already." She looked at Logan. "I brought him with me when I expanded. I thought we were past it. I thought we'd both grown up." "He was waiting," Logan said. "Or he was fine for a long time and then he wasn't." She shook her head. "I'll never know which. It doesn't really matter now." She looked at her hands. "But I want you to know that. Because you know almost everything about this situation, and that's a piece of it. The reason I didn't see it earlier is partly because of who he was to me. Once. The reason the betrayal is what it is." Logan thought about it. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I didn't want you to find out from a press piece." She looked at him steadily. "It'll come out. It usually does. The financial press likes the personal angle. How do you feel about it coming out?" "Like I have no say in it," she said, without self-pity. "And like the truth isn't something I need to be ashamed of." She paused. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have. That's not unusual. The unusual part is that I'm standing on the right side of it." Logan looked at her. The living room was quiet. Sophie's white noise machine running through the bedroom door, the building settling around them. "Marcus Calloway," he said. "That's why you said his last name the first night, like it was a formality." She looked at him for a second. "You noticed that? You said Marcus Calloway. He's our chief strategy officer. With the last name, like you needed the professional distance." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I did." Logan looked at the window. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for the company stuff. For the personal part." She turned her mug in its small circle. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Doesn't always matter." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They sat with that for a while. Outside, December was doing its thing, the city lights catching in the glass, the streets below with their early dark. It was the kind of evening that sat on the chest slightly, the year running out, the cold that moved into everything by 6 o'clock and stayed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "You said, a few weeks ago, when I asked about the moment when people decide the thing they have isn't enough, you said you had experience with it, different circumstances." He'd known she'd held on to that. "Yeah," he said. "You don't have to tell me." "I know." He looked at his hands. "Claire, my wife, she grew up with money. Not Hale Systems money, but comfortable. Her family had a business, real estate. It did well. When we got married, she was working for them, and I was doing what I do now. And for a while, that was fine. We were fine." He stopped. "But her family never thought I was enough. Her father especially. He was patient about it, the way you describe. For years. And then when Sophie was born and Claire was home and I was the only one working, he started in on it. Why was his daughter living in a rental? Why hadn't I done more with myself? What was the plan?" Victoria was listening. Not performing listening, actually listening. "And Claire tried," he said. "She defended me every time, but I could see what it was doing to her. She was caught between two things, and she loved both of them, and there was no version where she didn't pay a cost." He paused. "The accident happened before any of it came to a head, before it became the thing that, I don't know, I'll never know what would have happened. He turned his coffee mug. But I spent a year after she died being angry at her family for making her carry that. And then I spent another year understanding that they were just people who thought money meant security. And they weren't entirely wrong about that. They just also weren't entirely right. Victoria was quiet for a moment. What happened to the relationship with her family? Her father died about 18 months after Claire. Heart, sudden. Her mother moved to Florida. We talk at Christmas. Sophie calls her grandma Elaine. He shrugged. Fine, it's fine now. Distance helps. I'm sorry about Claire, Victoria said. I know you know I am, but I want to say it plainly. Thank you. And I want to say something else. She waited until he looked at her. I understand why you wanted nothing to do with someone like me when I moved in. I want you to know I understand that. Logan looked at her steadily. You were a stranger, he said. That's all it was. Logan? I mean it. It wasn't personal. I'd made a rule and you were caught by the rule. That wasn't fair to you. She held his gaze. I wasn't exactly putting out a neighborly welcome either, she said. I was barely here. When I was here, I was on the phone or working. She stopped. I was the person who had the fancy doormat, but never actually looked at it. He looked at her. Something shifted. Not in the room, in him, somewhere behind his ribs where he'd been keeping a door closed for a while. Sophie noticed the doormat, he said. Sophie notices everything. She does. She gets that from you, Victoria said. He looked at her. I don't know about that. I do. She said it simply, without pressure, without any apparent awareness of what it cost him to hear it. You noticed things, Logan. You noticed I was scared before I'd said a word. You noticed I wasn't eating. You noticed what I needed in rooms before I knew I needed it. She paused. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. He didn't know what to say, so he looked at the coffee table and sat with it, the way he'd been sitting with things for 2 months now and let it occupy its space. The week before Christmas, 2 things happened. The first was that Harriet Gould was confirmed as interim chair of the Hale Systems Board, replacing the 2 members who'd been removed. Victoria told Logan this on a Tuesday in the kitchen, briefly, without flourish, and he said that's good. And she said yes, and they moved on, because by December they had stopped needing to perform significance to each other when something significant happened. The second thing was that Sophie got sick. It started as the standard school winter thing, a Wednesday night cough that seemed minor, a Thursday morning temperature that seemed manageable, a Thursday afternoon temperature that was not. Logan picked her up from school at 1:30 because the nurse had called, and she was flushed and unhappy and fell asleep in the car before they reached the building, which was unusual because Sophie didn't sleep in cars. The doctor visit confirmed an ear infection and a throat infection and prescribed 2 things that the pharmacy took 45 minutes to fill, during which time Logan sat in a plastic chair with Sophie asleep across his lap and thought about the particular exhaustion of being a single parent when one of the 2 of you was sick, which he'd done 6 times now and which never got easier in the mechanical sense, only more familiar. He texted Victoria from the pharmacy. Sophie's sick, ear and throat. I might be dark for a few days. Her response was immediate. What do you need? He typed, nothing. We're okay. Just wanted to explain in case I go quiet. 3 dots appeared and then disappeared twice. Then, I'm coming over tonight. He started to type something that was going to be a version of you don't have to, but he'd said that to her enough times now that it had started to feel like a reflex he didn't mean anymore. He typed, okay. She arrived at 7 with soup from the place 2 streets over that had the good wonton soup, and also with 2 things she'd apparently stopped to buy. A second box of the children's fever reducer, in case they ran out, and a fresh packet of construction paper because Sophie had mentioned 2 weeks ago that she wanted to make Christmas cards, but they were out of the red paper. Logan opened the door and looked at all of this. I didn't know what you had, she said, by way of explanation. I have soup. Now you have more soup. He let her in. Sophie was on the couch in her pajamas with Peanut and a blanket, watching television with the glazed, slightly miserable expression of a sick 6-year-old. And when Victoria came in with the soup bag, she turned her head and her expression changed. "You came," she said. Her voice was rough from the throat infection. "Of course I came," Victoria said. "I have an ear infection and a throat one," Sophie said, with the mild pride of a child presenting a notable injury. "Both at the same time? That's ambitious." Sophie smiled despite herself. "Daddy said that too." "Your father is a wise man." Sophie shifted slightly on the couch, making space in the particular way she made space. Not asking verbally, just making the geometry clear. Victoria sat in it. Sophie leaned against her side, the same unconscious way she'd done on the couch weeks ago watching cartoons, and Logan stood in the kitchen doorway with the soup containers and watched his daughter close her eyes with the expression of a person who is still miserable but has just decided the situation is acceptable. He went to get bowls. Bought. The three of them ate soup on the couch. Sophie had half a bowl and declared the wontons the best thing she'd ever eaten, which she said about one thing per week. But tonight Logan thought she particularly meant it. And then Sophie fell asleep between them around 8:30, going under quickly the way sick children do, here and then completely gone. Logan and Victoria sat on either side of her and spoke quietly over her sleeping head, the television turned down to background noise. "How are you doing?" Victoria asked. "Fine. It's just an infection." "I know. I meant in general." He looked at his daughter's face, slack and flushed, the particular abandon of a child who trusts completely that nothing bad is going to happen while she sleeps. "Better," he said. And then, because it was true and the room had earned it, a lot better than a few months ago, actually. Victoria looked at him. "Because of the situation?" "Partly." He looked at her. "Partly because of you." She was very still for a second. "I haven't done anything," she said. "You've been here," he said, "every Saturday. More than that. You've been—" He stopped, worked out what was true. "Sophie lights up when you come over. You know that. You've seen it. And He stopped again. "I forgot what it was like to have someone to talk to. An actual person, in the apartment, not just the two of us." He looked at Sophie. "We were doing fine. I want to be clear about that. But fine and good aren't the same thing. And I think we've gotten to good. And that's—" He stopped. "That's because of you." Victoria looked at Sophie's sleeping face for a moment. "She's been good for me too," she said. "You both have." She was quiet. "I came here in October carrying everything alone. I'd been doing that for so long, I'd stopped noticing it was a choice." She turned slightly to look at him, and they were close. The sleeping child between them, the room quiet. "You showed me something else. Not by doing anything dramatic, just by being consistent, making pasta, making tea with honey, sitting at the table when it was a bad week." She held his gaze. "That's not small. People don't understand that's not small." Logan looked at her. In the living room light, she looked tired in the good way, the way people look when they're tired and also at rest, which were different things. The careful armor she'd carried that first night, the practiced composure of someone who lived permanently on a stage, was completely absent. He had the thought that he was probably one of very few people who had seen her like this, and the thought had a weight to it. "I want to tell you something," he said. He could hear the echo of her using those same words earlier in December, and she heard it too and waited with the same patience he'd given her. "I've been careful," he said. "For 4 years I've been very careful about keeping things simple, not letting things get complicated. It made sense. I had Sophie and I had work and I had enough, and I told myself that was the right call." He looked at the floor. "And then you knocked on my door and you said please and something—" He stopped, finding words for a thing he'd been not finding words for 2 months. Something cracked open, and I've been trying to decide whether to be scared of that or not. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "And?" she said. "I'm still a little scared," he said. "But I think I'm done being careful." She looked at him steadily, and there was something in her face that wasn't performed and wasn't managed, and wasn't the public-facing version of anything, just a real person, in a real room, sitting with a real thing. "I'm scared too," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not walking into this with—" She shook her head. "I've been wrong before, about who people are. I've trusted the wrong version of someone and paid for it." "I know. I'm not saying that to— I'm not making it a condition. I'm just—" She looked at him. I want you to know it's real for me. Not the company, not what you did at the board meeting. This. She looked at Sophie, then back at him. This table, this couch, this kid. This is the thing I've been coming here for. I know, he said again. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat there for a while, the sleeping child between them, the apartment holding its ordinary sounds, the pipes, the elevator, the particular creak of the third floorboard that Logan had memorized 2 years ago and would probably know for the rest of his life. At some point, Logan moved Sophie to bed, careful with her, Peanut tucked back in the crook of her arm. Victoria stood in the doorway while he settled the blanket and turned off the lamp, and when he came back out, she was in her coat. I should let you sleep, she said. Yeah. She looked at him for a moment. Then she took one step forward and put her hand against his jaw. Just for a second. Just a touch. The way you touch something you're making sure is real. And then she dropped her hand and stepped back. Good night, Logan, she said. He looked at her. His chest felt like it did at the end of a long day of physical work, used up and full at the same time, the specific ache of having done something that mattered. Good night, he said. She went across the hall. He stood in his own doorway until the click of her lock, and then stood there a moment more in the yellow hallway light with its faded carpet. And he thought that this was how it happened. Not in dramatic gestures or clean revelations, but in soup brought to a sick kid, in a coat hung on a hook that became her hook, and 2 months of small accumulations that added up to something neither of them had planned on. He thought about Claire. He thought about her in the clean way now, without the guilt that used to come with thinking about moving, the worry that forward meant forgetting. He knew better now. He'd spent 4 years learning that the people you love don't diminish when you let yourself live. They just find their right place. Not behind you, not gone, but settled into the foundation of who you are, present in every good thing you do because they helped make you someone who could do it. He went inside. He checked on Sophie one more time, still sleeping, fever slightly down, Peanut in his place. And then went to bed. Outside, December was turning toward Christmas in the city's reliable way, all lights and cold, and the ordinary insistence of time moving forward. Logan lay in the dark and listened to the building and felt the specific quiet of a man who had stopped fighting something and was finally, carefully, ready to let it be what it was. Not everything was figured out. The legal proceedings had months left to run. Victoria had a company to rebuild and a culture to change and a year of consequences to manage. He had a crew to run, a renovation that was behind schedule, a kid who would have 2 infections until Friday and would need 3 days of soup and patience. None of it was figured out. But we'll figure out the rest was a real thing he'd said to a real person who had said okay back to him. And in the particular arithmetic of lives that had both been quietly depleted by loss and work and careful self-protection, that was a number that added up to something. He closed his eyes. Down the hall, the elevator moved. The pipes ran their familiar current through the east wall. The building settled in December, the same way it always had, the same way it would keep doing. Logan Pierce, 32, single father, renovation contractor, the man who had spent 3 months making a careful point of not knowing his neighbor's name, fell asleep thinking about almond croissants. Sophie's ear infection cleared by Saturday, right on the timeline the doctor had predicted, and she celebrated her recovery by eating an entire bowl of cereal, demanding pancakes as a follow-up, and informing Logan at 7:45 in the morning that she felt completely fine and could he please text Victoria because she wanted to show her the Christmas card she'd made with the red construction paper. Logan made the pancakes first, then he texted Victoria. She came over at 9 with coffee from the bakery and sat at the table while Sophie presented the cards one by one with the gravity of an artist at a gallery opening. There were 6 cards. 1 for Logan, 1 for Victoria, 1 for Mrs. Toronto down the hall, 1 for Gus, the building manager, 1 for Biscuit, the lobby cat, which Victoria pointed out might be difficult to deliver, and Sophie said she would put it near the food bowl, and one that Sophie held for a moment before handing across the table. This one's for you and Daddy, she said. Together, because you're a team. It was 2 figures drawn in red crayon, side by side, with a smaller figure between them that had a large round head and what appeared to be an elephant under one arm. Victoria looked at the card for a long moment. Logan looked at the table. This is the best card I've ever received, Victoria said. I made the small one look like me, Sophie said. So you remember which one I am. I will never forget which one you are, Victoria said. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went to deliver Mrs. Toronto's card personally, which she did by knocking very seriously on 1403 while Logan watched from the hallway to make sure she got there. Mrs. Toronto opened the door in her house dress, received the card, and said something in Italian that made Sophie look pleased even though she didn't understand it. When Logan came back into the apartment, Victoria was still at the table. The card was in her hand and she was looking at it with an expression he'd learned to recognize. The unguarded one, the one that showed up when she stopped managing herself. He sat down across from her. "You okay?" he said. "Yes." She set the card down. "I was just thinking that I've been given awards, industry recognition, the kind that comes with a plaque and a dinner and people applauding." She looked at the crayon drawing. "This is better." "It's the small one with the elephant that does it," he said. "It's everything about it," she said. January came in cold and clear, the kind of winter that didn't bother with drama, just a steady, honest cold that settled into the city and stayed. The legal proceedings against Callaway moved into their formal phase, which meant depositions and document productions and the specific grinding process of institutional accountability, which was slow and unseeable from the outside, but which Priya assured Victoria was moving correctly. Callaway's defense strategy, as it emerged, was the one Victoria had predicted, a story about a founder who had become erratic and whom he had been trying to protect, an account of his own actions as a loyal executive responding to crisis rather than creating it. It was a coherent story. It was also contradicted at 17 specific points by documentation, and every week that passed, more of his own communications came into evidence through the discovery process, and each batch was worse than the previous. Victoria summarized all of this for Logan on Tuesday evenings, which had become, without either of them naming it as such, the night she came to dinner. She sat at his table and told him what was happening, and he listened and asked the questions that occurred to him and occasionally said things that helped her see the shape of it differently. And he had no formal understanding of corporate law or financial fraud proceedings, but he understood people, and he understood leverage, and he understood the difference between someone who was scared and someone who still thought they had a play left. "He still thinks he can make it about narrative," Victoria said in late January. "He doesn't understand that when the documents exist, the narrative doesn't matter." "Because he got away with narrative for a long time," Logan said. "Exactly. He learned the wrong lesson from his own success." She turned her wine glass. They'd graduated from coffee to wine on Tuesday evenings sometime in December, not by discussion, just by evolution. His whole career was built on being the smartest person in the room at reading people and shaping perception. And he was. For years, he was. He just eventually ran into something that wasn't a person. Paper doesn't care how charming you are. "Does that give you any satisfaction?" She thought about it honestly. "Less than I expected," she said. "I thought when it was clearly going to go this way, when it was obvious he was going to face real consequences, I thought I'd feel something larger. Vindication, maybe." She shook her head. "Mostly I feel tired, and a little sad, which I didn't expect." She looked at Logan. "He was my friend once, before everything else. I keep forgetting that and then remembering it." "Grief is complicated even when the person is still alive," Logan said. "When someone you trusted turns out not to be who you thought, that's still a loss. You're allowed to grieve it." She was quiet for a moment. "Claire's father," she said. "You said you were angry at him for years." "Yeah." "What made it stop?" He thought about it. "He died," he said, "which I'm not recommending as a method. But when he died, I realized I'd been spending energy on the anger that I could have been spending on Sophie, and the anger wasn't doing anything except existing." He turned his glass. He'd loved Claire in his way. He'd been wrong about me, and that wrongness had cost something, but he'd loved his daughter. Holding on to the anger was like holding a door shut against someone who was already gone. Victoria absorbed this. "I think about that sometimes," she said, "about Callaway. Whether there's a version where I'm just done with it. Not once the proceedings finish, but now. Whether I can let the legal process be the legal process and not carry the personal part of it in addition. Can you?" "I'm working on it." She paused. What helps is that it feels finished. Whatever he and I were to each other, it's finished. The legal proceedings don't change that. It finished a long time ago, and I didn't know it. She looked at him. I think sometimes you have to go through something completely to know it's actually over, not just tell yourself it is. Logan thought about Claire, about the particular way grief moved, not in a straight line, not by stages, but in the complicated nonlinear path of something that was always with you, and slowly became something you could carry instead of something that carried you. Yeah, he said. I think that's right. The thing between Logan and Victoria didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a single moment or a defined conversation. It accumulated, the way most real things accumulate, in increments small enough to miss individually, but significant enough to notice in aggregate. He started keeping the decent coffee she liked. She started keeping the honey on his counter rather than in the cabinet, because it was always going to be used. He knew her work schedule well enough to know when she was in back-to-back meetings and would come home depleted, and on those evenings he'd sometimes text, "Dinner's here if you want it." She never said thank you for those texts anymore, which was its own kind of milestone. She just said 20 minutes and showed up. She knew that Thursday afternoons were hard for him because Thursday was the day Claire had died 4 years ago. He'd mentioned it once, in passing, the context now forgotten, but she'd held on to it. She didn't acknowledge Thursdays explicitly. She just tended to knock on Thursday evenings, some pretext about something, a recipe she'd tried, a question about a renovation issue at the office. And she'd stay for a while. And Logan understood that she'd worked out what he needed on Thursdays without being asked, and he let her do it without making it a thing. Sophie observed all of this with the focused attention of a scientist monitoring a hypothesis. She said nothing directly, but she had stopped asking whether Victoria was coming over, which implied that the question had become so obviously yes that asking it was unnecessary. In February, Logan's brother Marcus, different Marcus, unfortunate timing on names, came to visit from Portland for a long weekend, bringing his wife and their 2 kids. Logan had told him almost nothing about Victoria except that there was a neighbor he was spending time with. Marcus lasted approximately 4 hours before pulling Logan aside in the kitchen. "The woman across the hall," Marcus said. "What about her?" "Sophie's talked about nothing else for 2 days. Sophie talks about a lot of things." "She called her daddy's person," Marcus said. Logan was quiet for a second. "She's 6, he said. 6-year-olds are not complicated, Marcus said. They just say the thing. He looked at Logan with the specific expression of an older brother who had been worried about something for a long time and had just received information that reduced the worry. "Are you happy?" Logan looked at the kitchen window. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Marcus put a hand on his shoulder briefly, the kind of contact that says everything by saying nothing, and then went back to the living room where his kids were dismantling Sophie's stuffed animal collection. Logan stood in the kitchen for a moment. Daddy's person. He turned the phrase over. He thought about the 23 steps between 1407 and 1408, which he now knew by heart in both directions. He thought about the almond croissant that had started all of this, and the wet woman in the hallway, and the honey he'd put in her tea before he'd known anything about her. He thought, yes, that's what she is. Marcus Calloway pleaded guilty to securities fraud and wire fraud in early March. The plea came after 6 weeks of his defense losing ground incrementally on every front, and it came without drama. A press statement from the DA's office, a brief court appearance, a sentencing date set for June. 2 of the other executives involved took plea agreements the same week. The third was proceeding to trial, which Priya said was a decision his attorney would come to regret. Victoria read the press statement on her phone, standing in Logan's kitchen on a Tuesday evening, the pasta boiling on the stove. She read it once, put her phone in her pocket, and stood at the counter for a moment. "Done?" Logan said. "Done," she said. He turned back to the stove. She came and stood beside him, slightly closer than necessary given the size of the kitchen, and picked up her wine glass and looked at the pasta boiling. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. "Like when you've been holding your breath underwater and you come up," she said. "Not dramatic, just air. Good." "Yeah." She took a drink. "Good." Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Is the pasta ready?" "2 minutes," Logan said. "Victoria, can you help me set the table?" "Yes," Victoria said, and she took the plates down from the cabinet. She knew which cabinet now. She knew where everything in this kitchen lived. And she carried them to the table, and Sophie got the forks. And they set the table together with the unconscious coordination of people who have done a thing enough times that the choreography is instinctive. And Logan watched them from the stove and thought that the ordinary beauty of a scene like this was the most underrated thing in the world. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Because these specific two people in this specific kitchen on this specific March Tuesday had been strangers 5 months ago and were now setting a table like they'd always done it together. Nothing about life guaranteed you this. Logan knew that better than most people. He'd had it once and lost it, and spent 4 years not being sure he'd find anything like it again. And here it was. Different. Its own shape entirely, but real in the same way that mattered. He drained the pasta. In April, Victoria's company launched a new initiative. She'd been working on it since January, quietly, alongside the legal proceedings and the ongoing work of rebuilding the executive team. She called it the HALE Foundation for Working Families, and its primary focus was support programs for single-parent households, subsidized childcare partnerships, flexible work arrangements for single parents within HALE systems specifically, and a grant program for single-parent entrepreneurs. She'd told Logan about it in February, in the tentative way she mentioned things she cared about before she was sure they'd work. "It's not altruism exactly," she said that February evening, in the particular honest mode she used with him. "I mean, it is, but it's also... I've been thinking about what I missed, what I didn't understand about how hard it is to build something when you're doing it with one pair of hands and a child who needs you in a world that mostly doesn't make room for that combination." She paused. "I had all the resources, and I still ran myself into the ground. Most people doing what you do don't have anything close to those resources." "Most people doing what I do aren't trying to run a company," Logan said. "No, but they're trying to run a life, and that's not easier." She looked at him. "I want to build something that makes it less hard. Even slightly. Even for a few hundred people a year." "That's not a small ambition," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I've learned something from you about what actually matters, and I'd rather do something with it." He'd looked at her when she said that. "What have you learned from me?" She'd looked back steadily. That showing up consistently is worth more than showing up impressively. That the small things aren't small. That a child's trust is the most honest metric of who you are. She paused. That it's possible to build a life that's genuinely good rather than just successful, and that those two things are much less connected than I'd been assuming for years. Logan hadn't had an answer for that. He'd looked at the table. "I put honey in your tea at midnight before I knew your name," he said. "That's not a lesson. That's just a reflex." "I know," she said. "That's the point." The foundation launched in April with a press event that Victoria gave a 10-minute speech at, and Logan watched it later on his phone because he'd been on a job site in Riverside, and he thought her speech was good. Direct, not sentimental, specific about what the programs would do and why. And he texted her afterward, "Good speech." She texted back, "I was nervous." He texted, "Didn't show." She sent back 3 words, "You always say that." He sat with his phone for a second and thought, "I do." And then he thought about the fact that always was a word they use now, unselfconsciously, in reference to each other, and that this was both new and not new at all, because in the way that counted, in the way that the bones of something feel, this had been building for 5 months, and always was just the word that had been waiting to describe it. The penthouse came up by accident. It was May, and the building manager Gus mentioned it in the lobby one morning while Logan was collecting mail. The top floor unit had been bought by a developer who was gutting it for renovation and needed a contractor to consult on the structural work. Gus mentioned it because Gus knew Logan's work and thought of him first for these things, which was a professional courtesy Logan appreciated. He looked at the job, walked the floor, gave the developer an honest assessment. The space was extraordinary. The whole 14th floor had decent views, but the penthouse looked out over the full sweep of the waterfront, north and south, the harbor visible on a clear day, the city spreading itself out in every direction like it was trying to be seen. He mentioned it to Victoria that evening. I'm working on the penthouse, he said. She looked up. In this building? Top floor. Developer bought it. Full gut renovation. I'm consulting on the structural. She was quiet for a second. I didn't know there was a penthouse. It's been empty since we moved in. The previous owner kept it as an investment. She looked at the ceiling as if she could see through the floors above them. How long will the renovation take? 6 months if everything goes right. 9 if it doesn't. Everything goes right about 60% of the time, she said. In my experience, exactly 60%, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her think. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Then, I was thinking about the view. He looked at her. She looked back. They were at the kitchen table and the evening light was doing the thing it did in May, coming in at that particular angle that made everything look slightly warmer than it was. And Sophie was in her room and the apartment was quiet. Victoria, he said. It's too soon to say it, she said. Probably. And it's a significant yes. And we'd need to... I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. Let's at least see it first, she said. He took her up on a Thursday afternoon when the crew was off-site. The space was in early demolition stages, bare concrete, exposed framing, dust sheets, and sawhorse tables. Not much to look at, but the windows were untouched, floor to ceiling on all 4 exposures, and in the May afternoon light the city came through them like a photograph of everything it could be. Victoria stood at the north window for a long time. Logan stood beside her. Below them, 14 floors of the Caldwell building, the street, the city in its layers. The harbor visible past the office buildings, a pale strip of water catching the afternoon. I've lived in 3 apartments since I moved here, Victoria said. All of them in buildings with services and security and the right square footage. She was quiet for a moment. This is the first building where I've ever known my neighbors. You know Gus, Logan said, and Mrs. Zoe, Toronto, and Biscuit. Biscuit doesn't count, he's a cat. Tell Biscuit that. She smiled. The particular real one, the short, surprised kind. She was still looking at the city. If we did this? She said. Yeah. It wouldn't be, I want to be clear about what I mean. I don't mean, I know what you mean, he said. You mean us, the 3 of us. A home. He looked at the window. Not your apartment with us in it, not my apartment plus you. Something that belongs to all 3. She looked at him. Yes, she said, that's exactly what I mean. He thought about Sophie, who had made a Christmas card for Daddy and Victoria together. He thought about the coat hook by the door that had become her coat hook. He thought about 4 years of careful, of closed, of doing fine, and telling himself fine was enough. He thought about a midnight knock, and a woman who said please, and a 6-year-old who had recognized something before either adult had been willing to name it. Let's talk to Sophie, he said. Sophie received the information the following Saturday morning with the focused seriousness she brought to significant matters. They sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Logan explained that they were thinking about moving to the top floor of the building, all 3 of them together, into a new apartment. And what did she think? Sophie considered this for a full 30 seconds. Then she looked at Victoria. Will you have your own room? She asked. Yes, Victoria said. Sophie nodded. And I'll have my own room. Yes, Logan said. And we'll all have the kitchen. And the living room, Victoria said. And the balcony. It has a big balcony. Sophie absorbed this. Can Peanut have a dedicated space? Logan opened his mouth. Yes, Victoria said immediately. Absolutely. Non-negotiable. Sophie appeared to find this a satisfactory resolution. Okay, she said. I think that's a good idea. Then she got down from her chair and went to her room, apparently done with the meeting, leaving the 2 adults at the table. Logan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Logan. That's it? He said. She's been waiting for you to catch up, Victoria said. She's been patient about it. He thought about a 6-year-old who had used the word team the second time the 3 of them were in a room together. A 6-year-old who had made a card with 2 figures and 1 small figure between them and called it together. A 6-year-old who had said, Logan will fix it to a worried woman across a kitchen table with the confidence of someone reporting a fact. She knew before we did, he said. Children always do, Victoria said. They don't have enough history yet to be afraid of the obvious thing. He thought about that for a moment, about how much of adult life was just history teaching you to be cautious about the things that were actually simple, about how many obvious things got ignored because the person looking at them had been hurt by obvious things before and couldn't fully trust their own eyes. He looked at Victoria. "I love you," he said. It came out without ceremony, without the careful architecture he might have built around it if he'd planned to say it. Just the thing, in the morning light, at the kitchen table, with the coffee going slightly cold. She looked at him. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was working out whether to be careful or not. Then she stopped working it out. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I wasn't going to say it first." "Why not?" "Because I was scared you weren't there yet." "I've been there," he said. "I just needed to make sure I was saying it because it was true, and not because I wanted it to be true. Those feel the same from the inside." She looked at him for a long moment. "How do you know the difference?" "You stop being scared of it," he said. "You're still scared of other things, but the thing itself—" He looked at the table. "It just sits there, and it's true, and you're not afraid of it anymore." She was quiet. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a while with the morning doing its thing around them and Sophie visible through the doorway, kneeling on her bedroom floor talking to Peanut about the logistics of moving, explaining patiently that his dedicated space would be near the window. The renovation took 8 months, which was closer to the 9-month projection than the 6-month one, because that was the nature of structural work. It revealed what it revealed, and you dealt with what was there. Logan ran the crew himself, which meant he was building the place he was going to live in, which was strange and satisfying in equal measure. He knew every pipe and joist and re-poured section of that floor the way he knew the dimensions of his own hands. Victoria moved some of her things to 1407 in September, while the penthouse was still being finished. Not officially, not with any announcement. Just gradually, over a few weeks, the coat on the hook was joined by more coats, and there were things in the bathroom cabinet that weren't Logan's and weren't Sophie's, and one morning Logan woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Sophie and Victoria having an involved conversation about whether cereals should be eaten before or after fruit, which was apparently a point of significant philosophical difference between them. He lay in bed and listened to the conversation and felt the apartment around him, the particular fullness of a place where people actually lived, where there were arguments about cereal and lost shoes and someone's laptop charger taking up the good outlet. He thought about the version of himself that had stood at a peephole at 12:14 in the morning and looked at a wet, scared woman in the hallway and stepped back from the door. He'd been so certain that simplicity was safety, that fewer people meant fewer things that could break. He hadn't been wrong exactly. Fewer people did mean fewer things that could break. But he'd confused the absence of risk with the presence of something worth protecting, and those were not the same thing at all. A life without breakable things wasn't safe. It was just empty. The fullness was the point. The fullness was always the point. You couldn't control what you lost. He knew that better than most. Claire had taught him that in the hardest possible way, and Sophie had taught him the corollary, that the answer to loss was not to stop accumulating what mattered, but to hold it well while you had it, to notice it, to put honey in the tea without being asked, to hang a coat on a hook and let it become her hook, to sit in a lobby at 1 in the afternoon and wait for someone to finish something important, to open a door at midnight because someone knocked and said, "Please." These were not grand gestures. They were just the texture of love in its working form, which was less dramatic and more durable than the version people performed for public consumption, and which left a different kind of trace in the lives it touched. They moved into the penthouse in November, 1 year and 1 month after the night of the storm. The moving took a weekend. Mrs. Toronto came up to see the place and stood at the north window with her hands clasped and said something that Logan didn't understand but that made Victoria smile. Gus inspected the renovation with professional appreciation and noted, correctly, that the tile work in the kitchen was exceptional. Biscuit was carried up by Sophie for an unofficial inspection tour and expressed indifference to the view, which Sophie found personally offensive. The first evening they spent there, the three of them were on the balcony. It was November, cold, clear, the harbor visible past the office buildings, the city doing its night thing below, all lights in motion. Sophie was in her jacket and her hat, Peanut under one arm, looking at the view with the expression of someone taking careful inventory. "It's very high," she said. 14th floor plus this one, Logan said. "So 15th, roughly. Can Biscuit come up here?" "He'd have to get in the elevator," Victoria said. Sophie considered the feasibility of this. "I think he'd do it," she said, "if I explained it properly." Logan looked out at the city. The harbor lights were beginning to show through the early dark, the water catching the last of the light before the sun finished going down. He thought about a hallway, a faded carpet, a peephole, and a woman standing in it, soaked and scared and holding a laptop bag like it was the only solid thing she had left. He thought about how close he'd come to not opening the door, not from cruelty, but from the careful self-protection of someone who'd learned that the things you let in were the things that could cost you. He'd opened it anyway. Not because he'd been wise enough to see what it was, just because she knocked and said please, and he was tired of being careful, and something in him had said, enough of this, let someone in. That was the whole of it when he looked back. Not a plan, not a decision made from clarity, just a door opened at the right moment by someone who had been closed long enough. And everything that followed, the tea and the soup and the fundraiser and the boardroom and the card drawn in red crayon, all of it had been the consequence of that one ordinary, frightened, necessary act of opening. He thought about what he'd known at 32 that he hadn't known at 28. Not much. You didn't accumulate wisdom cleanly, the way movies implied you did. You mostly accumulated damage, and occasionally, if you were paying attention, you figured out that the damage had shown you something real. It showed you where your walls were. And once you knew where they were, you had a choice. Keep them, or decide that some walls weren't built for protection. They were built from fear, and fear was a bad architect. Victoria moved slightly closer to him at the railing. Their arms touched. He didn't move away, and neither did she. Sophie was looking at the harbor with the complete attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting. "You can see far from here," she said. "Yeah," Logan said. "Can you see where we used to live?" He looked. The Caldwell building's lower floors were not visible from this angle. They were in the Caldwell building, and physics prevented that particular view. But he understood what she meant. "No," he said, "but it's right below us." Sophie looked down at the balcony floor as if she could see through it. "So we're still there," she said, "just also up here." Logan looked at his daughter for a second, this 6-year-old person who had been with him through everything. Through the worst years when he was getting up every morning and doing it again because the alternative was not doing it. Through the gradual, effortful climb back towards something that felt like a life rather than a sustained exercise in survival. Through the Saturday mornings and the almond croissants and all the weeks that had accumulated into this November night on a balcony 15 floors above the city. "Yeah, Bug," he said, "we're still there, just also up here." She nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and went back to looking at the harbor. Victoria looked at Logan. He looked at her. The city spread itself out below them in every direction, lit and alive and indifferent to the small specific lives happening in it, the way cities always were. Thousands of stories running simultaneously, most of them invisible to each other, most of them containing more grace and more mess and more ordinary love than the people in them would ever think to name. He had stopped being careful. He did not regret it. "Cold?" he said. "A little," she said. "We can go in." "Not yet," she said. They stood on the balcony in November with Sophie between them and the city below them and the year turning in its reliable way toward what came next, and Logan Pierce, who had spent 3 months pretending not to know the name of the woman across the hall, thought that the distance between a closed door and an open one was the shortest and longest distance there was, and that the only real question in either direction was whether you were brave enough to stop pretending you didn't know what was on the other side. He had been brave enough. That was enough. That was everything.